Hey, welcome back. Pull up your blanket, get comfortable, and let me tell you something before you drift off tonight. Imagine this. It is 4 in the morning. The air is 15:30. You're standing in a room so hot that the sweat on your arms dries before it even has a chance to drip. The air smells like burning wood, raw meat, and something else. Something harder to name. Smoke, maybe. Or maybe just fear. Because in this place, one wrong move, one overcooked dish, one moment of carelessness, and your entire life, as you know it, falls apart. You're not a soldier. You're not a knight. You're a cook. And the man you're cooking for is Henry VIII. Now, most people hear that name and picture the famous portrait, the wide-legged stance, the fur collar, the expression that says, "I have already decided I do not like you." And honestly, that portrait tells you everything you need to know about what it felt like to work in his kitchen. You were always just one bad meal away from disaster. But here's what I find truly fascinating about this story, and why I think it deserves more than just a footnote in a history book. Behind every single one of those extravagant Tudor feasts, behind every roasted swan and spiced venison pie and gilded sugar sculpture, there were real human beings. Ordinary people. People who woke up before sunrise and worked until the fires finally died. People whose names we mostly do not know, whose stories got buried under 5 centuries of dust and silence. Tonight, we're going to bring them back. So let us start at the beginning, because before we can understand what it felt like to work in a Tudor kitchen, we need to understand just how enormous, how breathtaking, and honestly how completely overwhelming the whole operation was. Hampton Court Palace, located just 15 miles from London along the River Thames. If you have ever visited, you already know it is a place that makes you feel small in the best possible way. Tall red brick towers, endless corridors, gardens that seem to go on forever. But what most tourists do not realize when they walk through those famous gates is that tucked into the north side of the palace was something that historians now describe as the most sophisticated food production facility of the entire 16th century. 55 rooms covering roughly 3,000 square feet. And during the peak winter months when the royal court was in residence, those 55 rooms were staffed by around 200 people running around the clock, producing somewhere between 600 and 800 meals every single day. Think about that for a moment. 600 to 800 meals twice a day, without electricity, without gas burners, without refrigeration, without a single modern convenience that we now take completely for granted, just fire, iron, stone, and human hands. Now, Hampton Court was not always this grand. The kitchen complex was originally built by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the powerful churchman who essentially ran England for Henry VII in the early years of his reign. When Wolsey constructed Hampton Court, he already had impressive kitchens because he was a man who entertained lavishly and understood that feeding powerful guests well was itself a form of political power. But then in 1529, everything changed. Henry VIII took the palace away from Wolsey. It was not exactly a voluntary gift, and immediately set about making it bigger, richer, and more impressive in every way imaginable. And when it came to the kitchens, Henry did not just expand them, he quadrupled them. Why? Because Henry VIII believed in something called bouche of court. It was a French phrase, and it essentially meant that the king provided free food and drink for his entire household, all 1,200 members of it. Every lord, every lady, every gentleman, every servant, every guard, every groom. If you were part of Henry's court, you ate at Henry's expense twice a day. On paper, that sounds almost generous, and in some ways it was. But it also meant that the pressure on the kitchen staff was constant, relentless, and completely unforgiving. There was no slow day. There was no quiet afternoon. The machine never stopped. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because there is something about this scale of operation that I think we genuinely struggle to appreciate today. We live in an era where we can order food delivered to our door in 30 minutes. We have grocery stores with everything from Peruvian quinoa to Japanese Wagyu beef available at any hour. We have dishwashers and food processors and ovens with digital timers. The Tudor kitchen workers had none of that, and yet they were feeding 1,000 people a day, twice a day, with food of extraordinary quality and variety. Roasted venison, spiced lamb, swan, peacock, and not just cooked but sometimes redressed in its original feathers for presentation. Conga eel, porpoise, pies filled with everything from beef to songbirds. The level of skill involved was genuinely astonishing. And I think that is the first thing we need to put firmly in our minds before we go any further into this story. These people were not primitive. They were not struggling primitively against an impossible task. They were professionals operating at the absolute peak of what human culinary skill could achieve in their era. They just happened to be doing it in conditions that would make any modern health and safety inspector pass out cold on the spot. Let me paint you a picture of what it actually felt like to walk into this place. The moment you crossed through the entrance courtyard of the kitchen complex, and there was a specific entrance, a tradesman's gate on the north side of the palace where all deliveries came and the sounds hit you first. Chopping the low roar of multiple fires burning simultaneously shouted instructions. The grinding of heavy iron on stone, and underneath all of it, a kind of constant rhythmic percussion. The turning of the spits, the thudding of cleavers, the clatter of putter and copper. Then the heat in the great kitchen itself, where 6 massive fireplaces lined the walls. The temperature in summer could become genuinely dangerous. These were not small decorative fires. These were industrial fires, roaring fires, fires that consumed 1.3 million logs every single year to keep the whole operation running. Workers who stood near the spit fires for hours at a time were regularly scorched, blistered, and bone-tired in ways that went far beyond ordinary physical fatigue. And then the smell. If you have ever stood next to a large open fire with meat roasting over it, you have some small idea. But multiply that by 6 fires. Add the steam rising from the boiling house next door, where enormous iron cauldrons bubbled constantly. Add the rich, dark scent of pastry from the bakery, the sharp bite of vinegar from the sauces, the almost overwhelming sweetness from the confectionery, where sugar sculptures were being assembled, and you begin to approach something like the sensory reality of this place. It was loud, it was hot, it was rich with smells, both wonderful and terrible, and it never ever stopped. What I find most striking, and this is something I genuinely keep coming back to whenever I research this period, is the contrast between what was happening upstairs and what was happening downstairs. Upstairs in the great hall and the watching chamber, the Tudor court was a world of color, music, beauty, and apparently effortless abundance. Courtiers in silk and velvet, tapestries worth more than most villages. The king dining under a canopy of gold cloth. Everything arranged to project an image of divine-touched power of a monarch whose table was as close to heaven's table as anything on earth could be. And downstairs, or rather tucked into those 55 rooms on the north side of the palace, 200 people were doing the back-breaking, blister-inducing, deeply unglamorous work that made all of that beauty possible. There is something about that contrast that feels very human and very timeless to me. The people who create the spectacle are rarely the ones who get to enjoy it. Henry VIII himself, by the way, did not actually eat food prepared in those great kitchens. He had his own private kitchen, a separate, smaller operation under the direction of his personal cook, a man named John Bricket, who held the elevated title of the Privy Master Cook. John Bricket cooked only for the king, and occasionally for the queen. He answered to no one but the monarch himself. The 200 workers in the great kitchens, they were cooking for everyone else. Now, the fact that we know John Bricket's name is itself rather remarkable, because for most of the people who worked in those kitchens, their names simply did not survive. History recorded the king. History recorded the courtiers, the lords, the ambassadors. Sometimes it recorded the master cooks who held positions of genuine authority. But the sculls who scrubbed the pots, the men who turned the spits, the boys who ran between departments carrying messages and ingredients, they worked in near total historical anonymity. And yet there is one document, one small extraordinary piece of historical evidence that tells us something real and immediate about the lives of the people at the bottom of this system. It is a royal order issued by Henry VIII himself, directed at the scullions working in his kitchens, and it reads in the language of the time as a command that they stop going about naked or in garments of such vileness as they do now, nor lie in the nights and days in the kitchen or ground by the fireside. Naked or in rag so bad they barely counted as clothing, sleeping on the kitchen floor next to the fires because they had nowhere else to go. Henry VIII, a man who changed his own velvet outfit multiple times a day, had to officially order his lowest kitchen workers to please wear actual clothes. That single document, to me, speaks volumes. It tells us that for the people at the very bottom of this system, the Tudor kitchen was not a place of warmth and abundance. It was a place of raw survival. They slept where they worked. They wore what little they had. And they kept those fires burning day after day, year after year for a king who had never once learned their names. I think about that sometimes when I'm standing in my own kitchen, my perfectly climate-controlled, well-lit, conveniently equipped modern kitchen, and I'm getting mildly annoyed because dinner is taking 20 minutes instead of 15. There were people 500 years ago who worked 18-hour days in smoke-filled rooms, sleeping on stone floors, to feed a court of 200 people, the most elaborate meals in the known world, and most of them never got so much as a footnote in history. That is worth sitting with for a moment, I think. But here's the thing. As brutal as those conditions were, and they were brutal, we will get much deeper into that as we go. There is another side to this story because for a lot of the people who ended up working in Tudor kitchens, this was not the worst life available to them compared to the alternative. And what was the alternative for a young man or woman in Tudor England born without land, without title, without any particular inherited privilege? Life outside the palace. Wolves was genuinely precarious. Agricultural labor was seasonal, poorly paid, and physically punishing in its own way. Illness, famine, and cold were constants. There was no safety net. A position in the royal kitchen, even a low one, came with guaranteed food, guaranteed shelter, a wage, however modest, and, crucially for those with talent and ambition, a pathway. You could start as a scullion cleaning pots and scrubbing floors, and work your way up through the ranks over years of service. The kitchen hierarchy was rigid, but it was not impermeable. Skill was noticed. Reliability was rewarded. In a world with very few ladders available to ordinary people, the Tudor kitchen was one of the few places where talent could genuinely change your life. Whether that's comforting or heartbreaking probably depends on your perspective. I find it both. So tonight, as we begin this journey together, that is the world I want you to hold in your mind. A world of fire and iron and extraordinary skill. A world of breathtaking inequality and surprising human resilience. A world where 200 people in 55 rooms kept the most powerful court in England fed twice a day. Every day, through heat and cold and exhaustion and smoke, and where most of those people lived and died without their stories ever being told until now, because we're just getting started. There is so much more to explore here. We've not yet stepped inside those 55 rooms and looked at what each one actually was. We have not met the extraordinary cast of characters from the all-powerful master cook all the way down to the people who turn the spits in silence for hours on end. We have not talked about the food itself, which was by any honest measure genuinely spectacular, and we have not yet talked about what it actually smelled like when someone made a mistake in Henry VII's kitchen. That story is coming up very soon. Stay with me, right? Then let us walk inside, because so far we have been standing at the edges of this story, looking at the palace from the outside, understanding the scale, feeling the weight of what this place meant. But now it is time to actually step through that gate. The tradesman's entrance on the north side of Hampton Court. The door that royalty never used, that courtiers barely acknowledged, that 200 working men passed through every single morning before the sun had fully risen. Walk through that gate with me, and I want you to pay attention to what you would have noticed first. Not the smell, not the heat, not the noise, though all of those are coming. What you would have noticed first is the system. And honestly, the more I have spent time with the historical records of this place, the more that system genuinely astonishes me. Because what Henry VIII built at Hampton Court was not just a big kitchen. It was something far more architecturally and organizationally sophisticated than that. It was in the truest sense of the phrase the world's first professional food production facility. Designed from the ground up, purpose-built, and operating at a level of logistical complexity that most modern restaurant owners would look at and find deeply intimidating. 55 rooms, 19 distinct apartments, each one with its own sergeant, its own staff, its own specific and non-negotiable function, and all of it fitted together like the internal workings of clock. Intricate, interconnected, and utterly dependent on every single part moving in precise coordination with every other part. Let me show you how it worked. The moment goods passed through that entrance gate, they entered a cobbled courtyard, a space the historical records called Master Carpenter's Court. And here, immediately something interesting happened. Before a single piece of food moved one step further into the kitchen complex, It was checked, weighed, counted, recorded. Overseeing all of this were a group of officials with one of the best job titles in Tudor history, the clerks of the green cloth. The name came from something wonderfully literal, a large green cloth that covered their accounting table marked with lines and columns that allowed calculations to be done directly on its surface. These men were in essence Henry VIII accountants, and they watched every penny, every joint of meat, every barrel of ale, every cartload of firewood. Nothing entered the kitchen complex without passing through their meticulous, obsessive record-keeping. Now, why does that matter? Why do I find those clerks of the green cloth so genuinely interesting? Because they tell us something fundamental about how Tudor people thought about the kitchen. In our modern imagination, when we picture a Tudor feast, we picture excess without limits. We picture a king who just waved his hand and food appeared. But the reality was the opposite of that. The Tudor royal kitchen operated under extraordinarily tight financial controls. Someone was counting. Someone was always counting. And the moment those numbers did not add up, the moment meat went missing or spices were unaccounted for, or barrels of wine disappeared faster than the record suggested, someone had a very serious problem on their hands. Henry VIII was extravagant. Yes, breathtakingly extravagant. But he was not stupid. And the people who ran his household on a daily basis were some of the most intensely organized administrators in England. So the goods passed through, they were checked, recorded, and sent in different directions to the right room, the right department, the right person who was expecting them and knew exactly what to do with them. And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Because each of those 19 departments was its own world, its own culture, its own rhythm, and specific knowledge. And what strikes me most looking at them side by side is how completely different the experience of working in each one must have been. Take the bakehouse. The bakehouse provided bread for the entire court every single day. And in an era before potatoes, before rice as a side dish, before the kind of starchy accompaniments we now take completely for granted, bread was not optional. Bread was the foundation of every single meal at every level of the social hierarchy. The court consumed around 200 of the heavy common loaves every day, and that was just the basic cheap bread, the everyday loaf eaten by the lower ranks. Above, there were finer grades of bread with the whitest, most refined Manet rolls reserved for the highest-ranking diners. Making this bread was a 9-step process. Measuring the wheat, seving the ground meal to separate coarser from finer flour, mixing the dough, weighing it precisely, shaping each loaf, leaving it to rise, then finally loading it on a long-handled wooden peel and sliding it into the enormous domed ovens built into the bakehouse wall. The largest oven at Hampton Court was, by historical record, 12 feet across. 12 feet, that is wider than most bedrooms. The baker sealed the oven door with leftover dough. You knew the bread inside was done when that sealing dough had cooked through. There was no timer. There was no thermometer. There was just experience, attention, and a very steady nerve. Now, if you were a baker, at least you spent your day in a space where the heat had purpose. You were working with it, shaping something with it. Move from the bakehouse deeper into the complex, past the central paved passage that served as the spine of the whole operation, and you arrive somewhere quite different, the boiling house. Picture a room dominated by a single enormous iron cauldron. The historical sources tell us the main boiling copper at Hampton Court had a capacity of around 75 gall. 75 gall. That is not a cooking vessel. That is a small swimming pool with a fire underneath it. The boiling house was where the process of cooking large cuts of meat began. Not finished, just begun. Joints of beef and mutton were parboiled here, first partially cooked in the great cauldron. For a very practical reason, it dramatically reduced the amount of time those pieces needed to spend on the expensive fuel-consuming roasting spits in the great kitchen next door. The Tudor cooks understood efficiency the way an engineer understands efficiency. Every log of wood that burned in these fires cost money. Reducing roasting time by pre-cooking in the boiling house was not laziness. It was smart resource management. Stews were also made here. Pie fillings, rich, long-simmered preparations that required patience and low, steady heat over hours. The people working in the boiling house spent their days in a cloud of steam, surrounded by the smells of simmering beef and mutton fat. The air so thick with moisture that, and this is one of my favorite historical details, something I came across while reading a description of the Hampton Court kitchens from a food historian who worked directly on their restoration in winter. The condensation from all that boiling water would sometimes cause a thin layer of frost to appear on the upper walls and ceiling. So you had a room that was simultaneously warm enough to cook 75 gall of water and cold enough on its upper surfaces to form ice. That is the kind of working environment we're talking about. Not uncomfortable in the way we think of uncomfortable. Genuinely extreme. From the boiling house, step back out into the central passage and look the other way. Because on the opposite end of that spine corridor, past the ladders and the fish storage area, were two rooms that represented a completely different world. The pastry house and the confectionery. These were the quiet rooms, or at least quieter. The pastry house had 4 large ovens, not for bread, but for pies, and the Tudor court was obsessive about its pies. Not just ordinary pies, not the kind of simple thing we might grab from a bakery window today, but elaborate constructed, architecturally ambitious pies that were as much about visual presentation as about flavor. The pastry cooks made what the records call coffins, raised pie crusts that could stand independently built from sturdy wholemeal dough, specifically designed to be a vessel rather than necessarily something you were supposed to eat. Inside went everything from venison to songbirds, from lamb to whole sides of deer for the most extravagant occasions. The king's own pastry, though, was different. His pies were made from the finest unbleached white flour. Even the casing of Henry VIII dinner was better quality than what anyone else was eating. And the confectionery. This was where the really theatrical work happened. Sugar sculptures, candied fruits, elaborate sweet preparations made from expensive imported sugar from Cyprus, spiced with cinnamon and ginger, and things that had traveled to England, from China and India, and across the Mediterranean. The people who worked in the confectionery were artists as much as cooks, skilled craftsmen producing work that was designed to stun, to impress, to signal wealth and sophistication. I often wonder what it felt like to spend your days in the confectionery versus the boiling house. Same building, same employer, utterly different realities. And here I want to ask you something, because I genuinely find this question interesting. If you were transported back to 1530 and told you had a position in this kitchen complex, but you got to choose which department, which room would you pick? The bakehouse, with its honest, methodical rhythm and the deeply satisfying smell of bread coming out of an oven. The confectionery with its artistry and its sweetness, but also its pressure to produce something perfect for people who would judge or work harshly, or somewhere in between one of the smaller working houses along the main passage, where more complex multi-step dishes were prepared requiring knowledge and technique. But away from the most brutal heat, I think about this more than is probably reasonable. Let me talk about the ladders because they tell a story that is easy to overlook, but genuinely important. The Tudor kitchen understood something that we now call food safety by instinct and practice rather than by science. The 3 ladders at Hampton Court, the flesh ladder for raw meat and game, the wet ladder for fish, which had its own cistern of water, and the dry ladder for pulses and nuts and preserved goods, were separated intentionally. Raw food and cooked food were kept apart. The latter sat along Fish Court, the long narrow passage running north to south through the middle of the complex. And the reason Fish Court worked as storage was architectural genius. So simple it is almost funny that particular passage ran in a direction that meant direct sunlight never fell into it. The walls stayed naturally cool. In an era without any form of mechanical refrigeration, someone had figured out how to build a refrigerator out of a narrow courtyard. Consider this. Across an entire year during the reign of Elizabeth, East Hampton Court went through 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 1,870 pigs, 1,240 oxen, 760 calves, and 53 wild boar. All of that meat came through those ladders. All of it was processed, stored, portioned, and sent to the right cooking department at the right time. And none of it had a label. None of it had a sell-by date. Everything depended on the knowledge, experience, and sheer professional judgment of the men responsible for those rooms. Remarkably, and I want to be careful here because it does surprise me, the historical record does not contain evidence of significant food poisoning outbreaks at the Tudor Royal Court. The system worked, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but it worked. These people knew their craft. There's one more room I want to walk you through before we leave this tour of the 55 rooms. A room that does not involve cooking at all, but that tells us more about how the whole system functioned than almost anything else. The scullery. The scullery was where the dishes came back. After every meal service, after hundreds of putter plates and iron pots and copper cauldrons, and wooden serving boards have been used, they returned to the scullery to be cleaned. The workers here washed everything in large stone pans, set over small fires to heat the water. They added least-stick solution made from wood ash to cut through the grease. They scoured with cloths and sand. And they did this for every single piece of kitchen, where twice a day, every day the court was in residence. The scullery also, by the way, was responsible for maintaining all kitchen equipment. Replacing broken items costs serious money. Historical records suggest repairs and replacements could run to more than 66 pounds in a single year, which in modern terms represents something close to $20,000. There is a contemporary account from a writer named Andrew Barclay, who observed the Tudor court in this period, suggesting that the communal cups in the Great Hall were scrubbed thoroughly only once a year, and that their interiors were black with accumulated grime. Whether that is entirely fair or somewhat exaggerated is hard to know from this distance, but it gives you a flavor of the gap that existed between the gleaming gold candle-lit splendor of the dining room upstairs and the operational reality of the room where everything was cleaned afterward. And honestly, I find that gap one of the most human things about this entire story. The performance of perfect, the reality of enough. So there you have it. The kingdom inside the kingdom. 55 rooms, 19 departments, a flow of goods and ingredients and half-finished dishes moving through a precisely calibrated sequence from one end to the other, raw at one end, finished and garnished, and ready to impress at the other. An architecture of food that no one in England had ever built before. And at every single station along that route, a person, a real named or nameless person who had learned their role, shown up before dawn, and kept that whole extraordinary machine turning. We have seen the rooms now. We have walked the passage. We understand the bones of this operation. But understanding a system is not the same as understanding the people who ran it. And the people, the hierarchy, the power, the ambition, the daily reality of what it actually meant to occupy a specific rank inside this world. That is where things get really interesting. Because in the Tudor kitchen, who you were determined everything, what you ate, where you slept, whether you were called by name or not called anything at all. The person at the very top of the system held more power than most people in England ever dreamed of touching. The person at the very bottom had a life that is almost painful to fully imagine. And the distance between those two people was measured not in floors or hallways, but in fire and sweat and 500 years of silence. Let us meet them both. Something funny happens when you spend a lot of time researching a place like the Tudor kitchen. You start at the big picture, the scale, the architecture, the sheer ambition of the thing. Then you move closer in, and the closer you get, the more you realize the Real story was never about the building at all. It was always about the people inside it. And in the Tudor kitchen, nothing shaped a person's daily reality more completely, more ruthlessly, more personally than one single thing. Their rank, not their talent, not their personality, not whether they were kind or funny or brilliant with a roasting spit. Rank, that invisible, immovable number that told you where you stood in a hierarchy, so precisely calibrated, so thoroughly organized that it governed what you ate, where you slept, who was allowed to speak to you, and whether you were a human being with a name or just a body in a room doing a job. I want to take you through this hierarchy today, from the very top to the very bottom, because I think it is one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the most unsettling things about this entire world. And because buried inside this hierarchy, if you look carefully, is a story about ambition and survival, and what it means to be a professional at something that the people above you will never fully appreciate. Let's start at the top. Above the kitchen itself, above all the cooking and the fire and the noise, sat the Lord Steward. This was the man, and it was always a man who held ultimate authority over what historians call the below-stairs world of the Tudor Palace. The Lord Steward oversaw every function that kept the court alive and operational food procurement staff, management, accommodation for servants, the entire physical running of the household. He answered to the king and only the king. The Lord Steward would not have spent much time in the actual kitchen. He was an administrator, a political figure in his own right, often a nobleman of significant standing. His relationship with the kitchen was the relationship of a corporate chief executive with a factory floor, aware that it existed, reliant on it functioning, almost certainly never standing at a fire turning a piece of meat. Below the Lord Steward was the Clare of the kitchen. Now, here's where things get interesting, because the Clare of the kitchen was the real operational brain of the whole food system. This was the person who held the keys literally to the storerooms, who kept the accounts, who allocated food as it was needed, who made out the reports for the Board of the Green Cloth, who managed a staff of 200 people running 19 departments simultaneously in conditions that were hot and loud and physically dangerous twice a day, every single day. We know from surviving records and portraits that the Clare of the kitchen was paid extremely well and dressed accordingly in expensive clothes that marked him visually as a man of consequence. He was not just a cook who had done well. He was a senior manager in one of the largest food operations in England, and he was treated as such. I find the Clare of the kitchen fascinating for a reason that probably sounds a little strange. He was a person caught between two worlds, not grand enough to be a courtier, not anonymous enough to be invisible. He was a professional in the truest sense of the word, a man whose value came entirely from what he knew and what he could do, not from who his family was. In a world structured almost entirely around birth and title, that was genuinely unusual. And it says something interesting about what the Tudor kitchen actually was. A space, perhaps one of the few spaces in that era, where demonstrated expertise meant something real. Now below the clerk of the kitchen, you had the structure that actually ran the cooking itself. The three master cooks, three of them, one assigned to cook for the king, one assigned to cook for the queen, and one for everyone else, the entire remaining court. Let that sink in for a moment. One master cook for the 1,200 members of Henry VIII court, and two master cooks for two people. That imbalance was not waste or excess. It was a precise statement of what mattered in this world. The king's food was the most important food, not because Henry necessarily ate more than everyone else, though looking at his later portraits, the question is not entirely unreasonable, but because the king's food carried political weight. It was a demonstration. Every dish that went to Henry's table was a message about the sophistication, the wealth, and the divine favor of the English crown. The master cook who served the king personally held one of the most high-pressure, high-stakes jobs in England, because the king's displeasure was not an abstract managerial concern. Henry VIII was, by every historical account, a man of intense and unpredictable moods. A bad meal did not just mean a disappointed diner. It could mean real and immediate professional, and in some cases personal consequences for the person responsible. We met John Brickett, the Privy Master cook, briefly back in part 1. What we know about him tells us a great deal about what this role required. He worked in a separate private kitchen specifically constructed beneath the king's own lodgings. His staff answered to him alone. His products went to one person's table, and everything, the seasoning, the timing, the presentation, the temperature at which each dish arrived, had to be perfect, or as close to perfect as human hands, working without thermometers or timers, could manage every single day. I genuinely wonder what kind of person that requires you to be. The combination of supreme technical skill and discipline under pressure, and the particular psychological steadiness needed to do flawless work for an audience of one. An audience who can and will take your livelihood away if he's not satisfied. That is not a comfortable kind of job, but it is unmistakably a remarkable one. Below the master cooks were the sergeants. Each of the 19 departments had its own sergeant. So you had the sergeant of the spicery, the sergeant of the pastry, the sergeant of the sorcery, and so on across the whole complex. These were the people who actually ran the day-to-day work of their specific domains. A sergeant might supervise up to 21 staff members, including his own Clare for record-keeping and a purveyor responsible for ordering supplies. The sergeant knew his department better than anyone. He knew exactly how much pepper the spicery needed for a week, exactly how many pie cases the pastry could produce in a morning, exactly which of his staff he could trust with the most delicate work and which ones needed watching. He was the embodiment of practical expertise, the person who had spent enough years in his corner of the operation to see every problem before it happened and solve it before anyone above him noticed. Below the sergeant were the yeomen, and below the yeomen were the grooms. And here's where the living, breathing texture of the hierarchy starts to become really vivid, because yeoman and groom were not just job titles. They were stages in a career that most people entered as children, sometimes very young children, and climbed with agonizing slowness, one small step at a time over years and decades. Think about that for a moment. Think about what I just said. Most people who had a professional career in the Tudor kitchen started as children, earning somewhere between 1 and 2 per year, plus their food. And then if they worked hard, behaved themselves, showed talent, caught the right person's attention, at the right moment they might advance. From turn spit, the absolute bottom of the skill labor pool, to groom, from groom to yeoman, from yeoman to sergeant, and for a very small number, all the way to master cook. That is a career ladder spanning decades. The whole arc of a working life. Maybe 2 or 3 decades of consistent service to climb from the bottom rung to somewhere approaching the middle. And the reason I find that so striking is not because it sounds hard, though it does sound hard. It is because of what it required. At every single stage of that climb, you were being observed. Your superiors were watching whether you showed up, whether you were careful, whether you could be trusted with progressively more responsibility and progressively more expensive ingredients. You were building a reputation inside an institution that had very long memories and very strict standards. There is something almost modern about that, if you strip away the historical setting. The idea of a career built through demonstrated reliability, through accumulating knowledge and trust over years, that is not so different from how professional advancement works today. What was different was the starting point and the conditions, and the fact that your employer was a king who could on a bad day have you dismissed with a word and no recourse whatsoever. Now let's talk about where all these ranks actually intersected with the rest of the palace. Because the hierarchy did not stay neatly inside the kitchen walls. It reached upward all the way to the dining room. And the document that governed that connection was one of the most extraordinary pieces of household administration in Tudor history. The Elam Ordinances, drawn up in January of 1526 at Elam Palace, and put together under the authority of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who was at that point arguably the most powerful man in England after Henry himself. The Elam Ordinances were a detailed rule book for the entire royal household. They governed behavior, ceremony, access, and perhaps most relevantly for our story, food. Specifically, who was entitled to eat what and where. The ordinances established what was called the bouch of court, a formal allowance for every named person in the household. Not just your 2 meals a day, also your daily ration of bread, wine, beer, candles, and firewood. The bouch of court essentially meant that your rank determined your entire material life within the palace. It determined whether you ate in the great watching chamber with the senior courtiers, or in the great hall with the general household, or somewhere in the kitchen complex with the working staff. And it determined not just where you sat, but what was put in front of you. The higher your rank, the more dishes you received, the more refined the quality of your bread, the better the wine in your cup. A senior lord at the high table in the great watching chamber was eating from a world of citrus fruit from the Mediterranean, spiced venison, elaborate pies with decorated crusts. A groom in the kitchen staff was eating beef and ale and bread adequate, certainly, and genuinely better than what most of England's peasantry had access to. But not even in the same imaginative universe as what was happening 40 feet away in the Great Hall. And here is the detail that gets me every time. The bread. In the Tudor world, the bread you ate was a direct, visible, publicly legible signal of your social rank. The cheapest bread, a rough mixture of rye and wheat, went to the lowest workers. Wholemeal bread went to the middling ranks, and the finest white Manet rolls, soft, expensive, made from the most refined flour, went to the highest members of the court. Everyone knew exactly what tier of bread you belonged to. It was not a secret. It was the point. Can I tell you something that strikes me personally about this? We talk a lot today about workplace culture, about whether people feel valued, whether the environment is inclusive, whether people have a genuine sense of belonging in the organizations they work for. And I think about this in relation to the Tudor kitchen, and I find myself with genuinely mixed feelings, because on one hand, this was a world of almost total rigidity. Your place was assigned, not earned in any straightforward sense, and the gap between the top and the bottom was not just large, it was written into everything. The food on your plate, the room you sat in, whether anyone looked at you when you walked past. But on the other hand, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, within that rigidity, there was something real, something that most people outside the palace walls simply did not have. The possibility of advancement, the existence of a clear, structured path that went somewhere. However slowly, however dependent on the goodwill of people above you, however contingent on circumstances you could not control, the groom who worked hard and showed skill could become a yeoman. The yeoman could become a sergeant. The latter existed, and at a time when most of the people in England were bound to the land they were born on with no ladder in sight at all. That was not nothing. It was genuinely not nothing. There is one more person in this hierarchy I want to mention, not because of their rank, but because of what their role reveals about the whole system's relationship with power. The Sergeant of the King's Mouth. That was the actual title. The Sergeant of the King's Mouth. His responsibility, along with a yeoman and a groom who served directly under him, was everything that touched Henry VII person at the dining table. The plates, the cups, the knives, the napkins, the scented water for washing the royal hands before the meal began. These objects were not ordinary kitchen equipment. The king's personal table was made of precious metals and set with jewels. Before each use, every piece was weighed by the treasurer and formally signed out. After use, it was formally signed back in. A royal goblet was not just a cup. It was an object of state tracked with the precision of a government inventory, and the Sergeant of the King's Mouth was the person responsible for that object from the moment it left the treasury to the moment it returned. He stood between the king and the kitchen, between the political theater of the royal table and the practical reality of the rooms where the food was actually produced. In a way, he was the whole system in one person. The place where the invisible work of 200 people met the visible performance of majesty. I want to leave you with one image that I think captures the Tudor kitchen hierarchy better than any number of organizational charts or historical documents could. Mealtime, 10 in the morning, the first service of the day. In the great hall, the tables are set and the lower courtiers are filing in, finding their places according to the seating arrangements the Lord Chamberlain has assigned. In the great watching chamber, the senior members of the household are settling into a world of silver plate and fine wine. And somewhere deep inside the palace's private apartments, the king's personal attendant is setting the royal table with objects that have been weighed and recorded and carried with gloved hands. And in the kitchen complex, 200 people are sending the food toward all of those rooms simultaneously, moving through that labyrinth of passage and courtyard and specialized chamber, carrying plates and pots and covered dishes. Each person knowing their exact role in this choreography, which room, which hatch, which hand to deliver, to which rank of diner gets which quality of dish. Every person in motion, every person in their place. And somehow, despite the heat and the complexity and the pressure and the rigid stratification of absolutely everything, it all worked. The plates arrived. The food was hot. The bread was the right kind for the right person. The king did not go hungry. It is the most extraordinary, everyday miracle when you think about it. A 200-person machine running on fire and hierarchy and the accumulated professional knowledge of people whose names most of us will never know. And yet of all the people in that building, the Lord Steward at the top, the clerks with their meticulous records, the master cooks with their impossible pressure, the sergeants with their domains, the yeomen and grooms climbing their slow, patient ladders. There's one group we have barely talked about yet. A group whose experience of this world was so physically demanding, so psychologically particular, so genuinely extreme that it deserves its own time. The people at the very bottom, not the grooms, not the entry-level staff. I mean the ones below even that. The ones whose job was not to cook, not to manage, not to oversee, but simply to stand in front of the fire and not stop moving. That story is next. Close your eyes for just a second. Go ahead. You can keep listening and picture the most physically demanding job you have ever done in your life. Maybe it was moving furniture in summer heat. Maybe it was a grueling construction shift, or a double at a restaurant in the middle of a dinner rush, or something that just left you completely empty at the end of it. That bone-deep tiredness where your hands still shake a little when you pick up a glass of water. Got it. Good. Now multiply that by about 8 hours. Do it again the next morning and the morning after that. Do it 6 or 7 days a week in clothes you may not have washed in weeks. Sleeping each night on a stone floor next to the same fire you stood beside all day. No days off except perhaps Sundays. No overtime pay. No workers' compensation if something goes wrong. That was the life of the person at the very bottom of the Tudor kitchen. And the truly remarkable thing, the thing that stopped me cold when I first really understood, is that this person, This forgotten figure at the absolute base of the hierarchy was arguably the single most essential human being in the entire food production chain. 'Cause without them, the fire would go out, and without the fire there was nothing. Let's talk about the spit worker. The name Spit Boy is how history is generally recorded. This role, and it is a name that is at once evocative and slightly misleading. At Hampton Court, given the sheer scale of what was being roasted, whole joints of beef, large cuts of venison, in some cases entire animals, the iron spits themselves were so heavy when loaded that the idea of an actual young boy managing them strains credibility. Food historian Peter Briers, who spent years working directly in the restored Hampton Court kitchens to understand the original processes, firsthand confirmed what the physical evidence of those fireplaces already suggests. This was work that required an adult with genuine physical strength. The loaded spit was not something a child could safely control for hours at a time, but the title stuck. Spit Boy, the lowest labeled rung on the ladder. The person you assigned to the hardest, hottest, most mind-numbing, repetitive physical task in the entire complex. So what was exactly? The great kitchen at Hampton Court had 6 enormous fireplaces along its walls, large enough, and this is documented, for a full-grown adult to stand upright inside them. These were not hearth fires. These were industrial furnaces, each one consuming seasoned oak at a rate that across all 6 fires added up to somewhere between 6 and 8 tons of wood every single day. Every single day. In front of each fire, the roasting spits were mounted on a slanted iron rack. The slant mattered. It allowed the spit worker to adjust the angle, moving the meat closer to or further from the heat, depending on how fast it needed to cook, and cooking meat thoroughly on a spit depending on the cut, and the animal could take anywhere from 40 minutes to several hours per piece. In a kitchen serving between 600 and 800 people twice a day, this was not an occasional task. The spits almost never stopped turning. The spit worker's job, reduced to its most basic description, was to sit on a small bench in front of that fire and turn constantly, steadily, for hours, in full view of the flames and the direct blast of a fire hot enough to roast large animals breathing smoke and rendered fat with no shade, no breeze, no distance from the heat whatsoever. And they had to do it. The historical record tells us, in full uniform. Even here, even in this most brutal physical role, the Tudor obsession with rank and presentation reached down to govern the person turning the meat. Now, I want to pause here because I think there is something genuinely counterintuitive worth sitting with. We tend to romanticize the idea of simple work. There's a whole genre of modern sentiment that says there is something honest and even beautiful about physical labor, about doing something with your hand, something concrete, something you can see at the end of the day. I do not entirely disagree with that. But the spit worker's job was not the satisfying physical labor of a craftsman. It was not the kind of work that sharpens a skill or builds something you can point to with pride. It was by almost any measure the most deliberately monotonous job imaginable. The 16th century equivalent of being the person who watches the progress bar on a computer screen all day, except the progress bar is on fire, and it weighs 60. Here is a detail I find haunting in its specificity. When a historian working with the restored Hampton Court kitchen team described the spit worker's physical positioning, he noted the existence of a small low bench. You can actually still see the space where it sat in front of the fireplace. That bench was where the spit worker sat. Not stood, sat. Because you could not stand at that distance from that heat for hours at a time without your legs simply failing. You sat, you turned, you sat and turned for hours in the direct radiant blast of one of the most powerful open fires in Tudor England. And here is the other detail that the historical record gives us delivered with the Bonedri matter-of-factness of an official document. In the days before the Elam ordinances and other royal household regulations attempted to impose some order, the spit workers at Hampton Court had taken to working without clothes, not as a statement, not as rebellion, simply because the alternative, wearing any fabric at all in the heat, was more than the human body could manage. Henry VIII had to issue a specific order telling them to please put their clothes back on, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure he was wrong to issue that order, but I'm also not entirely sure I can blame them. There is a whole dimension to this story that arrives when you understand what happened to spit turning as the Tudor period developed, and it is one of the stranger chapters in kitchen history. By around the middle of the 16th century in household across England, not just at Hampton Court, but in wealthy homes everywhere. A solution was being found to the spit-turning problem. A solution that says a great deal about how people in that era thought about labor, about animals, and about the relationship between the two-turned spit dogs. Small, deliberately bred animals. Long-bodied, short-legged, stocky, with coats of various colors specifically engineered through generations of selective breeding for a single purpose, to run in a large wooden wheel mounted on the kitchen wall. The wheel was connected by a chain to the spit. As the dog ran, the spit turned. The dog ran continuously because if it stopped, the spit stopped, and if the spit stopped, the meat burned. To keep the dogs running at the right speed, the training method was to throw a piece of heated coal into the wheel. The dog ran faster to avoid the coal. The spit turned to the correct rate. The naturalist Johannes Kuys, who was royal physician during Elizabeth I's reign, wrote about these animals in his 1576 catalogue of English dogs, the earliest such catalogue on record, categorizing the Matterhoff factly as a distinct working breed. The great Charles Darwin would later cite the turnspit dog in his discussions of selective breeding as one of the clearest examples of how humans had shaped animals to serve particular needs. The breed was eventually classified by the Latin name Canis vertigus, which translates with a grim poetry as dizzy dog. The only fully intact specimen we know of today is a stuffed individual named Whiskey, held in a museum in Wales. Now, what strikes me most about the arrival of the turnspit dog is not the obvious question about animal welfare, though that question is entirely legitimate and the answer is not comfortable. What strikes me is the logic that produced this innovation. For most of human history, the solution to a physically unbearable job was simply to assign it to the most powerless person available. When a most powerless person reached their limit, when the conditions became genuinely incompatible with the human body, only then did someone look for an alternative. The spit dogs were not an act of compassion toward the human workers. They were an act of efficiency. The human workers were at some level becoming too expensive in terms of their physical deterioration, if nothing else, to keep doing this particular task indefinitely. The dogs were cheaper. That is a deeply uncomfortable observation, and I think it is also an accurate one. Let us move from the fire to the floor. Because the spit worker was not the only person living at the extreme bottom of the Tudor kitchen world. The scullion occupied a different kind of misery, where the spit worker's suffering was primarily thermal, all heat, all fire, all relentless physical effort in proximity to flame. The scullion's world was its opposite. Cold water, lye, grease, and an endless, genuinely endless succession of dirty pots. The scullion did not cook. The scullion cleaned up after everyone who did. And in a kitchen, producing 600 to 800 meals a day using iron pots, copper cauldrons, putter plates, wooden boards, and 100 other implements. The cleaning was a task of almost incomprehensible scale. Every pot that had bubbled all day in the boiling house came back to the scullery. Every roasting pan dripping with rendered fat. Every plate that had carried food to the great hall. The cauldrons, some of them holding 75 gall. All of it. The cleaning solution was lye. A caustic liquid made from wood, ash dissolved in water. Add sand and a cloth. Scrub everything twice a day. No gloves. No protective equipment of any kind. Just hands and lye. Hands in cold water. Hands in grease over and over again until the shift ended, or until your skin simply gave out. There is a contemporary account from a writer called Andrew Barclay, who observed the Tudor court and commented on the state of the common drinking cups in the Great Hall, suggesting that they were thick with accumulated grime and scrubbed seriously perhaps only once a year. Whether that is fully accurate or somewhat exaggerated is hard to know from this distance. But the image it conjures of the gap between the ideal and the reality of cleaning in the Tudor palace is striking. And it tells you something about the scullion's reality. Infinite pressure, finite hands, and a cleaning task so enormous that even keeping up with it was a form of success. And then there is the question of where these people slept. I mentioned this briefly in our first part, the royal order that the scullion stopped sleeping on the kitchen floor, but I want to come back to it now, because the more I think about it, the more it tells me about the daily reality of life at the bottom of this world. Servants at Hampton Court who held no specific lodging assignment, essentially anyone below a certain rank, slept where they could in and around the kitchen complex. Not in proper beds, not in assigned rooms, in the corners of the rooms where they worked. on the stone floors, close to whatever warmth remained in the fires through the night. The kitchen floor was their bedroom. The fire was their heating system. The smells of that day's cooking, the grease and smoke and rendered fat, were the smells they fell asleep to. And when the morning bell rang and the fires needed to be rebuilt and the day's work needed to begin, they were already there. They had never left. Now, I want to be fair here, because history sometimes flattens nuance in the direction of pure misery, and that is not entirely honest either. The historical record also tells us clearly that these work, difficult as their conditions were, had certain real and meaningful advantages over people outside the palace walls. They were guaranteed food, not fine food, but adequate food every day. They had shelter of a kind. They had a wage, small as it was. In an era when agricultural laborers outside the palace gates faced seasonal unemployment, genuine hunger during bad harvest years, and the constant precarity of life without any institutional support whatsoever, having a spot on the kitchen floor of Hampton Court Palace was not nothing. It was genuinely a step above the alternative for many people. That is the thing about the Tudor kitchen that I keep having a hold in my head simultaneously. The conditions were harsh by any measure, and they were still better than what most of England's poor were living with. Both things are true. The human capacity to adapt to difficult circumstances is extraordinary, and the Tudor kitchen workers had adapted to theirs. But adaptation is not the same as flourishing, and surviving is not the same as thriving. Here's a question I genuinely find myself turning over. If you were a young person in England in 1530, poor, without education, without connections, without any inherited advantage of any kind, and someone offered you a position at Hampton Court at the very bottom of that kitchen hierarchy, what would you have said? I think you would have said yes, probably without hesitation, because the alternative was harder, colder, less certain, and offered no ladder at all. The spit boy at least had a path. However long, however slow, however dependent on things outside his control, he had somewhere to go if he worked, and if he endured, and if fortune was even slightly on his side. The person turning rocks over in a field on a January morning in rural England had no path, just a field, and another field after that. There is one more detail about the bottom of the kitchen world that deserves a moment, because even in the most difficult circumstances, even in the least glamorous role, the Tudor kitchen preserves something that I think is genuinely important to acknowledge: a form of mastery. Not the high mastery of the master cook, not the administrative genius of the clerk of the kitchen, but the mastery of a person who has learned to do an almost unbearable job without breaking down. The spit worker who had developed the particular physical endurance and the specific technique to turn a loaded iron spit steadily for hours without losing control of the meat. The scullion who had learned which tools responded best to which cleaning methods, who could move through a mountain of dirty pots at a pace that kept the supply chain moving. These were skills, quiet, unrecorded, unacknowledged skills, but skills nonetheless. And the people who held them were professionals in the oldest sense of that word. People who had learned to do something difficult reliably day after day, in conditions that would defeat a person who had not put in the time. History did not record their names. History was busy writing about the king, but they were there. They showed up. They turned the spit. They scrubbed the pots. They kept the fire alive. And every bite of roasted venison that went to Henry the Seventh table began with their hands. We have spent a lot of time now at the extremes of this world. The sprawling architecture, the hierarchy from top to bottom, the daily reality of those who work closest to the fire and the floor. But there is something we have not yet examined that runs through every single level of this system, binding it together, shaping every decision from how ingredients were sourced to what ended up on the king's plate. Something that the Tudors understood in their bones, even if they had no scientific vocabulary for it. The supply chain, the extraordinary, complex, geographically ambitious system that had to function perfectly before anyone in that kitchen could do a single thing. Because you can have 200 workers in 55 rooms and 6 roaring fires. But if the meat does not arrive, if the spices do not come in from the other side of the world, if the water does not flow from the spring 3 miles away, the whole magnificent machine grinds to a complete and very hungry stop. How that supply chain worked, where the food came from, and just how far the Tudor world reached to feed one man's table. That is where we are headed next. You know what genuinely surprises me? Every time I think about it, We live in an age of global supply chains, refrigerated containers, crossing oceans overnight, air freight, GPS-tracked delivery trucks, just-in-time logistics software that coordinates thousands of moving parts in real time. And we still consider it remarkable when your online order arrives in 2 days. The Tudor royal kitchen was doing something structurally not that different. Without any of that, 5 centuries before the first refrigerated truck rolled down a road, the people responsible for feeding Henry VIII court were managing a supply chain that reached from the cold springs of the English countryside to the spice markets of Venice, from the fishing towns of the Kentish coast to the vineyards of Gascony and France, from the deer parks of the royal estates to the freshwater ponds sitting quietly in Hampton Court's own gardens, and somehow, every morning the food was there. Let me walk you through how. Start with the thing most people overlook when they imagine a Tudor feast. Not the roasted meats, not the exotic spices. Start with the most essential, most unglamorous, most fundamental ingredient in the entire operation. Water. Fresh, clean, drinkable water. The kind that could be used for cooking, for cleaning, for boiling, for sauces. The kind that in Tudor, London and its surroundings was genuinely not guaranteed. The Thames running past Hampton Court was also the waterway that carried waste. Downstream sources were unreliable. Contamination was a real and constant risk. So, here's what the Tudor royal household engineers did, and I find this quietly extraordinary. They laid a system of lead pipes, 3 miles of them, connecting Hampton Court Palace to a natural spring source outside the town. 3 miles of underground piping, bringing clean water directly into the palace complex. It was functional and genius, and it meant that the kitchen had access to fresh water essentially on demand. Think about what that meant operationally. The boiling house could run its 75-gallon copper cauldron without worrying about running dry. The scullery had water for cleaning. The pastry department could make dough. Every department that touched water, and almost all of them did, had a reliable, clean supply. That pipe, those 3 mi of CUDA engineering, was as essential to the kitchen as any master cook or roasting fire. Without it, the whole machine stopped. Now the meat. We covered the numbers earlier. The astonishing annual provisioning figures from the reign of Elizabeth I. 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 1,870 pigs, 1,240 oxen, 760 calves, and 53 wild boar in a single year. I want to spend a little more time with those numbers because I think they deserve it. That is roughly 22 to 23 animals being processed through the kitchen complex every single day the court was in residence. Not per week, per day. And this was not a special occasion figure. That was the baseline, the ordinary operating number for a standard year. Where did all of it come from? The short answer is everywhere. The longer answer reveals a system that was part agricultural management, part political economy, part seasonal planning, and that required the kind of forward-thinking logistics that most modern organizations would recognize immediately. The royal estates provided a significant portion of the game. Henry VIII was passionate about hunting, and his deer parks were spread across his 60-odd palaces and properties around England. The venison that ended up in Hampton Court's kitchens had often been living in a royal park days earlier, managed by the royal park keepers, whose entire job was to maintain a stable, healthy, harvestable population of deer for exactly this purpose. Cattle, sheep, and pigs came from farmers and suppliers who held contracts with the royal household formal arrangements, negotiated and renewed, specifying quantities, delivery schedules, and quality standards. The court moved around enough and consumed enough that these contracts were serious economic relationships. Being a supplier to the royal household was not a minor thing. It was steady substantial income and the social prestige of the royal warrant. The ability to say your farm supplied the king's table was not nothing in 16th-century England. But here is where the supply chain gets genuinely interesting. Because not all ingredients could be sourced domestically. Not even close. The Tudor court's appetite for fish was immense. And this was not entirely a matter of preference. The Christian calendar mandated fish eating on Fridays, Saturdays, and Wednesdays in some parts of the year, and the entirety of Lent in a court of 200 people, with 2 meals a day, that added up to a vast and constant demand for seafood that England's rivers and nearby coastal waters could only partially satisfy. The royal household had a specific contractor for fresh sea fish. The historical records name him Thomas Hewitt of High in Kent. He was the court's chief supplier of fresh saltwater fish, operating out of High on the Kent coast. Close enough to Hampton Court by river that fish could be delivered while still genuinely fresh, which in an era without ice was no small logistical achievement. But Hewitt could only supply what the sea around Kent offered seasonally. For freshwater fish, Hampton Court had something else entirely. Something that was sitting right under the noses of modern tourists who visit the palace and admire what they see without knowing what it was. The sunken gardens. Those beautiful, geometrically arranged sunken areas in Hampton Court's grounds. Visitors walk past them today as ornamental features pause to photograph the flowers and move on. But those sunken areas with their walls dating back to 1536 were not originally gardens at all. They were fish ponds, 3 of them stocked with carp and bream, maintained by the palace's own fish keepers, producing freshwater fish on site and on demand. In Berlin, who at the time was not yet queen, but was already very much the center of Henry's attention, actually wrote a letter to Cardinal Wolsey in 1528, specifically requesting fish from the Hampton Court ponds to be sent to her. If the fish were good enough for her in Berlin to write a personal request for them, they were good fish, and those ponds were right there. No delivery required. No supply chain disruption. When the kitchen needed carp, someone walked to the pond. Let us talk about the ingredient that most clearly reveals what the Tudor supply chain was actually connected to at its furthest reaches. Spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, mace, nutmeg, saffron. These were not occasional additions to the Tudor royal kitchen. They were constants used in large quantities central to the flavors and the visual presentation of court food, and every single one of them had traveled an almost incomprehensible distance to reach Hampton Court's kitchen. Cinnamon came from Sri Lanka, cloves from the islands of Southeast Asia, what we now call Indonesia, mace and nutmeg from the same region, black pepper from the Malabar coast of India, saffron, the most expensive of all, native to Southwest Asia, and requiring extraordinary human labor to harvest each stigma picked by hand, thousands per pound, ginger from Asia. To reach Henry VIII's kitchen, each of these spices had passed through merchant hands in Asian ports, been loaded onto ships across the Indian Ocean, been transferred through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, moved across Egypt or Arabia, entered the Mediterranean, passed through Venetian or Genoese trading houses, which held near monopoly control over the European spice trade. In this era, been shipped again to English ports purchased by royal purveyors in London markets, and finally transported the 15 miles upriver to Hampton Court. The price reflects the journey in 15th-century England, and prices had not fallen dramatically by Henry VIII's time. A pound of pepper cost more than 2 full days' wages for a skilled craftsman in London. A pound of cloves cost nearly 5 days' wages. And saffron. A pound of saffron cost roughly a full month's wages for the same craftsman. Let me give you a sense of scale. The Duke of Buckingham's household in the early 15th century went through approximately 2 of spice every single day. At the royal court, with its 200 members and its ambitions to impress every visiting ambassador and foreign dignitary, the quantities were larger still. Every gram of that saffron, every pound of that pepper had sailed through multiple seas and passed through multiple hands across multiple continents before it arrived at Hampton Court Spicery, where the yeoman of the spicery would lock it away and distribute it with the careful controlled precision of someone handling an asset of genuine financial value. Because that is exactly what it was. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you pour cinnamon into your coffee this morning, if that is your thing, you probably do not think about how it got there. It appeared on a supermarket shelf in a little jar with a label for a couple of dollars. It is normal, ordinary, unremarkable. In 1530, that same cinnamon represented an almost literal voyage to the edge of the known world. The people who harvested it had no idea their product would end up in a royal palace in England. The merchants who shipped it through Venice had only the vaguest sense of its final destination. And the cook who ground it at Hampton Court probably had no particular conception of Sri Lanka as a place only as the distant, almost mythological origin of something precious. The spice rack in your kitchen isn't a real since the final chapter of a 500-year story about how the world became connected. And the Tudor royal kitchen was one of the first chapters of that story. Beyond spices, the supply chain extended in another direction that the historical records note with quiet precision wine. Barrels of wine arrived by boat from across Europe. French wines, the red wines of Gascony, known to the Tudor as claret, were constant. Sweet wines from the Mediterranean, which were prized for dessert courses and special occasions. Spanish wine, German wine from the Rhine. The wine cellar next to the kitchens held European vintages from multiple countries simultaneously. There was also the ale and beer supply. Beer was stored separately from the wine cellar, a practical recognition that these were entirely different products for different purposes. Beer and ale came from London and the south of England, brewed by suppliers who delivered to the palace by river. The Thames was not just a scenic backdrop to Hampton Court. It was the highway that kept the palace running. Goods arrived by barge, continuously timber for the fires, wine from London, fish from high grain from the royal estates. The river made the whole operation logistically possible. Without it, provisioning a court of 200 people 15 from London's markets would have been exponentially more difficult. And then there is the wood. This is the supply chain element I find myself most unexpectedly fascinated by, because it is the most invisible to our modern imaginations. We have talked about the 1.3 million logs consumed annually in Hampton Court's fires. We have mentioned the 6 to 8 tons of seasoned oak burned in the kitchen fireplaces alone every single day the court was in residence. Seasoned oak, not just any wood. Oak that had been cut, stored, and dried for a minimum of 1 to 2 years before use, so that it burned cleanly and hot rather than smokily and inefficiently. Managing the fuel supply for Hampton Court meant having at any given time a stockpile of tens of thousands of logs in various stages of seasoning. Someone was always cutting wood. Someone was always stacking it. Someone was always counting it, just as the clerks of the green cloth counted everything else. There was a specific room in the kitchen complex called the King's Coal House, and there were separate arrangements for the charcoal stoves that appeared in the kitchen alongside the main open fires. Every fuel source had its management system, its supplier, its storage arrangement, and its accountant keeping track of what came in and what went out. The supply chain, in other words, was not just about food. It was about energy. And in an era when all energy came from burning something, maintaining that supply was as important as maintaining any other part of the operation. There is one more piece of this supply chain story that I think deserves a moment of genuine reflection. We tend to think of local and seasonal eating as modern ideals, as something sophisticated and environmentally conscious that we've recently rediscovered. And in some ways that is true. But the Tudor royal kitchen was deeply local and deeply seasonal by necessity in a way that shaped everything about what was cooked and when. All food in Tudor times was by modern definition organic, but most of it was also only available during specific windows. Perishable goods had to be supplied daily. The kitchen's purchasing and provisioning followed the rhythm of the seasons with an intimacy that we've almost completely lost contact with. Certain meats in winter, certain fish in spring, certain fruits. Only when the orchards around the palace and across the royal estates came into season. The herb garden at Hampton Court supplied fresh herbs to the spicery. The spicery was also responsible for managing the fruit from 2 palace orchards, apples, pears, and whatever else the English climate would yield. This was not background detail. This was core provisioning. The palace grew some of what it ate in gardens that stood right next to the buildings where people slept and worked and cooked. The scale of Hampton Court's kitchen operation was extraordinary, global in its reach through the spice trade and the wine cellars. But its foundation was local. The spring 3 miles away. The fish ponds behind the kitchen gardens. The orchards just visible from the kitchen windows. The farmland of the surrounding estates. Global ambition built on local roots. That balance, honestly, is not so different from the best of what we try to do today. So now we have the rooms, the people, the hierarchy, the hardest jobs, and the supply chain that fed the whole enterprise. We understand how this world worked at a structural level. From the water pipes to the Venetian spice merchants, from the king's private fish ponds to the oak forest being cut and stacked years in advance. But there is a question we've been quietly circling around that I want to address directly. Because no matter how sophisticated the logistics, no matter how brilliant the architecture, no matter how skilled the workers, the entire kitchen system ultimately existed to produce one thing, the food itself, and specifically what arrived at Henry VIII's table. What those 6 fires and those 200 workers and that supply chain reaching from Sri Lanka to to Kent were ultimately trying to achieve twice a day, every day. Because the food was not just food, it was one of the most elaborate, most theatrical, most deliberately spectacular performances of power that the 16th century produced. And understanding what ended up on those plates and why it looked the way it did, and what it was designed to communicate, that changes everything about how you see this whole story. There's a scene I keep returning to in my imagination. It is 1527. The Great Hall at Hampton Court is lit by hundreds of candles. Real wax candles, not cheap tallow, because wax candles are for people who matter and tallow is for people who do not. The French ambassador and his delegation are seated as honored guests of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. The tapestries on the walls are worth more than most English villages. The musicians have been playing for an hour. The wine is from France, and it is excellent. And then the servants bring in the second course, except the second course is not in any conventional sense food, at least not primarily. Moving through the great hall, arranged on wide boards and carried by liveried footmen with absolute formality, are more than 100 sugar sculptures, not small decorations, not little figurines perched on the edge of a dish. Full architectural models of castles, a scale replica of the spire of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, built from sugar paste, standing upright, holding its shape under the candlelight. Animals, birds, human figures, some fighting with swords, some jousting on horseback, some dancing, all rendered in sugar, and a complete chess set, every piece individually sculpted the board, and all 32 pieces made entirely of sugar paste. The French ambassadors were so stunned by the chess set that at the end of the evening, they asked if they could take it home with them. Wussy boxes it up and sent it. That is Tudor dining. That is what 200 people in 55 rooms were ultimately working toward. Let me tell you something that's took me a while to fully absorb about Tudor court food. Because when most of us think about historical feasts, we think about gluttony. Henry VII throwing chicken bones over his shoulder, mountains of meat, rivers of wine, the Hollywood version of medieval excess, all roaring and graceless. But that image is wrong. Historically provably, demonstrably wrong. The Tudor court feast was at its best one of the most carefully considered, deliberately constructed aesthetic experiences in the history of English culture. It was not about eating until you could not move. It was about display, about artistry, about communicating status and power and cultural sophistication through the medium of food. It was, as historian after historian has concluded, less like a meal and more like a performance. And at the heart of that performance was one principle that governed everything. Every choice of ingredient, every decision about presentation, every piece of theatrical extravagance. That principle was this: what you eat and how it is presented tells everyone in the room exactly who you are. The Tudor did not just eat food. They ate their identity. They ate their politics. They ate their relationship to power and beauty and the divine order of things. And the kitchen workers understood this whether or not they could have articulated it in those terms. Every dish that left the serving hatches was a statement. And those 200 people in those 55 rooms were the ones writing the statement. Let us start with the structure of a formal Tudor meal. Because the structure itself was a performance of hierarchy before a single dish had been touched. A formal court dinner was organized into 2 main courses, each of which could contain a dizzying number of dishes presented simultaneously rather than sequentially. These were not courses in the way we think of them: appetizer, then main, then dessert, one after another. They were courses in the sense of a large wave of simultaneous dishes all arriving together, the table suddenly laden with options, while servants stood ready to serve from each platter. The documented menu for a formal dinner served to Henry VIII, and his queen listed for the first course alone bread, ale, wine, a thick meat broth, Chinese of beef, venison, roasted VE with herbs of custard. The second course, jelly cream of almonds, pheasant heron bitten, a now protected wading bird, shoveler, duckcocks, pulvers, larks, and rabbits. Venison and fine pastry tarts, fritters, 2 courses, roughly 14 to 16 individual preparations, many of them involving birds that most modern English people have never eaten and cannot even necessarily identify by sight. And here is what is important to understand about that menu. It was not a special occasion menu. That was a standard formal dinner, not a state banquet, not a celebration for a foreign ambassador, just an ordinary day of dining for the king and queen. Now, Let's talk about the food itself, the actual dishes, because this is where Tudor cooking becomes genuinely strange and genuinely wonderful in equal measure, depending on your perspective. The most famous, or most notorious, depending on your taste, was the kickress, a dish that exists somewhere on the spectrum between culinary engineering and theatrical provocation. The cockantry was created by taking the front half of a roasted piglet and sewing it seamlessly to the back half of a roasted turkey, or in some versions the reverse turkey front pig back. The resulting creature stitched together at the join and presented whole on a platter was entirely fictional. It had never existed as an animal. It was a joke, a trick, a deliberate act of culinary surrealism designed to make guests look twice and then look again. Was it tasty? Probably reasonably so. Roasted pork and roasted turkey are both perfectly good. Was that the point? Absolutely not. The point was the spectacle. The point was that your host was powerful enough and creative enough to serve you a mythical animal at dinner without batting an eye. Then there was the peacock. Peacock was not actually considered particularly delicious in Tudor times. Historical cooks and writers noted fairly candidly that the meat was tough and GY, but peacock appeared on the finest Tudor tables not because it tasted good. Peacock appeared because of what it looked like. Because the process of preparing peacock for a royal feast required skinning the bird in its entirety, before cooking carefully, patiently, keeping every feather intact and attached to the skin, then roasting the naked bird, and then after cooking reconstructing the peacock in its full plumage, every blue-green feather reattached, the gilded beak touched with gold leaf, the crown of feathers fanning behind it. More ambitious cooks placed camphor or alcohol-soaked cloth inside the bill before the bird came to the table. When a flame was touched to it, the peacock appeared to breathe smoke. A fire-breathing peacock gilded, feathered, and fully reassembled, carried into a room full of candlelight and music. Tell me that is not theater. But of all the things I've learned about Tudor court food, the aspect that genuinely surprises me most every time is the Tudor relationship with color. We think of medieval and Tudor food as brown. Roasted things and boiled things and stewed things. All shades of beige and tan and dark brown. That is the mental image, and it is profoundly incorrect. The Tudor court kitchen was obsessed with color. Deliberately, intentionally, lavishly obsessed, and the color of a dish was not decoration. It was communication. Certain colors signaled certain ingredients, and certain ingredients signaled certain wealth. Getting the color right was as important as getting the flavor right. Yellow came from saffron or from egg yolk. Green came from parsley juice or spinach that had been pressed, strained, and reduced to a pure pigment. Red came from sandalwood, the same reddish-brown wood that was used in incense now being ground and used to stain gingerbread and sauces. Blue came from indigo. And for the most spectacular occasions, dishes were presented in alternating stripes of color, green and yellow, red and gold, so that the table looked from above like a tapestry come to life. Sweet dishes were sometimes adorned with actual gold and silver leaf. Not gold-colored foil, actual hammered gold and silver applied with small brushes to the surface of marzipan sculptures and sugar paste figures. The people who ate this food were eating gold, and everyone watching them eat it knew exactly what that meant. Let me tell you about the subtleties, because they deserve more than a passing mention. A subtlety was the ornamental set piece that formally announced each course of a feast. Before the dishes of the first course arrived, the subtlety came first, carried in procession set in place at the high table, where the most honored guests sat, admired, and then eventually, if edible, consumed. For major occasions, subtleties were made from marzipan, the Tudor version, which they called marchpane, a smooth paste of ground almonds and sugar, or from elaborate sugar paste that could be molded, carved, and colored with extraordinary precision. And the subjects chosen for these sugar sculptures told you everything about the politics of the room. A bishop's installation feast would feature a subtlety depicting a religious scene appropriate to the new bishop's patronage. A feast honoring a foreign dignitary might feature their coat of arms rendered in colored sugar paste, a compliment that doubled as a display of the host's intelligence in knowing and representing the guest's heraldic identity correctly. For the very grandest occasions, the subtleties were architectural castles with identifiable towers, cathedrals with recognizable spires, all sculpted from sugar by the confectionery workers whose skilled hands had spent days or weeks on a single piece that might be on display for 45 minutes before being ceremonially dismantled and eaten, or in wool-size case in 1527 packed into a box and sent home to France as a diplomatic gift. I think about those confectionery workers sometimes, the people whose job it was to carve St. Paul's Cathedral from sugar paste by candlelight, working without power tools or precision instruments, producing something detailed enough that a group of well-traveled French diplomats recognized it immediately and wanted to keep it forever. Their names are gone. Their work lasted maybe an hour, and it was magnificent. Now, I want to talk about the thing that most powerfully separates the Tudor feast from anything we experience today. Something that most food historians note, but that tends not to stick in popular imagination. The Tudor court feast was not primarily about pleasure. Or rather, it was about pleasure, but pleasure was not the point. The point was power, and the Tudors understood that food was one of the most effective instruments of power ever invented, because it engaged every single sense simultaneously. The smell of spices that had traveled from India, the visual shock of a fire-breathing golden peacock, the texture of sugar dissolving on the tongue, the sound of the musicians and the rustle of silk and the scraping of silver against pewter, the taste of saffron and cinnamon and things that had never existed in England before Henry VIII court made them available. No visiting ambassador could sit at that table and feel anything but aware, viscerally, physically, sensory overwhelmed, aware of the wealth, sophistication, and reach of the English crown. This was diplomacy conducted through the stomach, and it was extraordinarily effective. A Spanish visitor to the court of Queen Mary, the first writing in 1554, recorded his impression of the royal table with barely concealed, or noting that the queen spent over 300,000 ducats a year on her table, not on her armies, not on her fleet, on her table, on the performance of royal abundance. That number was meant to be known. It was meant to circulate. The spectacle was the message. Here is the thing that connects this directly to the 200 workers in those 55 rooms, and that I think is important to hold in mind. Every one of those theatrical touches required human skill of the highest order. The peacock reassembly required someone who understood bird anatomy well enough to skin the creature without tearing a feather, then to reverse the process after cooking. The sugar sculptures required someone who understood how sugar paste behaved under different conditions of humidity and temperature, who could carve with precision, who could apply color with the accuracy of an artist. The colored jelly castles required someone who understood how clarified bone broth set, how to get the right consistency, so that it would hold architectural shapes and could be unmolded cleanly on the table. This was not unskilled labor dressed up in fancy clothes. This was craft at a level most modern kitchens could not replicate today without significant study and practice. And what I find genuinely moving about it, though I'm not sure moving is quite the right word, is that all of this extraordinary skill was directed ultimately toward creating something impermanent. A feast lasted a few hours. A sugar castle lasted maybe the length of a diplomatic dinner. The fire-breathing peacock, once it came to the table, was on display for perhaps 20 minutes before the carver began to work. Then it was gone, eaten or cleared, and the kitchen prepared to do it again. There is a popular misconception about Tudor feast that I want to address directly before we move on, because movies and television have been very persistent about it, and it drives food historians absolutely to the wall. The Tudor did not throw bones on the floor. They were not graceless, roaring, finger-licking animals flinging food around the hall. Tudor court dining was, by every contemporary account, a deeply formal, ceremonially structured, carefully regulated event. Table manners were codified and observed. The Dutch writer Erasmus, who visited England multiple times and dined at court, wrote a specific list of instructions for dining at the Tudor court that covered everything from how to hold a napkin to how to share dishes politely with the person seated next to you. The historical record notes that Henry VIII himself was contrary to every film depiction actually described by contemporaries as a quite neat and precise eater. He was a man of enormous appetite. Certainly, by the end of his life, his waistline had expanded from approximately 32 in at the age of 30 to 54 in at the age of 55, which tells you something about the quantity of food involved. But the manner of his eating was, by the standards of his time, considered refined. Elbows were not placed on the table. Noses were not picked at meals, though apparently they could be discreetly wiped on a sleeve, which is its own kind of window into a different era. Head scratching was forbidden. Food was taken from shared serving dishes with the left hand and eaten with the right, using the thumb and first two fingers, a practice that required more conscious discipline than it might sound. And perhaps most interestingly, spoons were used, and after use they were cleaned by wiping them on bread, not on a cloth, on bread. Bread was the universal utensil. All of this, the theater, the artistry, the politics, the precision, the extraordinary sensory spectacle was the destination that the supply chain and the workforce and the 55 rooms existed to reach. Every morning that the fires were lit, and the water flowed, and the meat arrived at the tradesman's gate, the whole elaborate machine was powering toward these hours, these dishes, these moments. And yet, and this is the thing that I keep coming back to, the people who made it happen almost never witnessed it. The kitchen workers did not dine in the Great Hall. They did not see the peacock arrive at the high table, or hear the French ambassadors gasp at the sugar chest set. They sent their work through the serving hatches, and it disappeared into the corridors and the candlelight, and they turned back to the fire and started preparing for the next service. They made the spectacle. They did not attend it. That gap between the making and the witnessing, between the labor and the glory, was one of the most defining facts of life in the Tudor kitchen. And it raises a question I find genuinely interesting, which is, did they know? Did the person who carved that sugar chest set understand the impact it was going to have? Did they take quiet pride in work they would never see displayed, never hear praised, never know, have been boxed up and carried across the channel to France? I think about that a lot. I genuinely think about that. But there's another layer to this world that we have not yet fully excavated. Because the kitchen's relationship with power was not just about what it produced. It was also about what it feared. And the fear inside the Tudor kitchen was specific. It was real, and it had a name. It was the fear of what happened when something went wrong. Of all the things that kept Tudor kitchen workers awake at night, and honestly with the heat and the noise and the stone floor, sleep itself was probably already complicated, there was one particular fear that sat differently from the others. It was not the fear of burning yourself on the Spitfire. That was an occupational hazard, predictable, manageable in its way. It was not even the fear of a sergeant's reprimand or a sergeant's fist, both of which were real possibilities in a world with no formal workplace protections whatsoever. The fear I am talking about was quieter than that, more abstract, and far more dangerous. It was the fear that something might go wrong with the king's food. Not through malice, not through any intention to harm, just through the 1,000 ordinary failures that happen in any kitchen. A source slightly off, a piece of meat not properly cooked through an ingredient that had turned without anyone noticing in time. Because in the Tudor kitchen, there was a specific category of mistake for which the consequences were not a reprimand or a dismissal. The consequences were something considerably worse than that. And the story that makes this reel more real than any amount of general historical framing is the story of a cook named Richard Roos. It is February of 1531. Richard Roos is the cook in the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Fisher is a powerful churchman, and this matters for what happens next. He is also a vocal, persistent, genuinely inconvenient opponent of Henry VIII's attempt to obtain a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. On the 18th of February, a pottage of thick meat broth is prepared in Fisher's kitchen and served to the bishop's household guests and servants. Fisher himself, for reasons that history does not fully record, does not eat his portion that day. Everyone else who eats the pottage becomes violently ill. 2 of them die. Not household guests. They are people who had called at Fisher's door asking for alms, and who had been given the remains of the cottage as charitable food. Their names were Bennet Serwin, a member of the household, and Alice Tryatt, a widow who had come begging at the gate. Both of them are killed. Richard Roos is arrested under questioning, and in the 16th century, questioning of a prisoner was not what we would recognize as a formal interview. He confesses that he had added something to the pottage, a powder. He claims it was a purgative meant as a joke. He was trying to make his fellow servants ill. He says he had no idea it would kill anyone. He had no idea anyone outside the household would eat it. A joke. A terrible, catastrophic, fatal joke. Henry VIII does not find this funny. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary moments in Tudor legal history, and one that changed the lives of every cook in England from that point forward. Henry VIII personally addresses the House of Lords about the Roos case. He is not addressing it as a routine matter of criminal law. He's addressing it because Richard Roos touched something that Henry cared about on a deeply personal, almost visceral level: the vulnerability of a powerful man to the people who handle his food. Henry was by every historical account a man with a significant and genuine fear of poisoning. This was not an irrational phobia in the context of 16th-century Europe. Powerful men were poisoned. It happened. The burghers in Italy had made poisoning practically a diplomatic tool. Tudor politics were brutal enough that suspicion came naturally. And Henry, who was in the middle of one of the most politically explosive moments of his reign, the struggle over his marriage to Catherine, the pressure from Rome, the emerging power of the Boleyn family, had every reason to be watchful about who had access to his food and what they were doing with it. So Henry had Parliament pass a new act, a specific retroactive act targeting Rose and his crime. And what it decreed was this murder by poison was no longer to be treated as ordinary murder. It was from this point forward an act of high treason. And the punishment for high treason in this case, specifically for this crime, was to be carried out in a manner that mirrored the method. Richard Roos was to be boiled alive in April of 1532 at Smithfield in London. That sentence was carried out. Now, I want to sit with this for a moment, because there are several things happening simultaneously here that I think are important to separate out. The first is the historical fact of the punishment itself, which is brutal by any measure. Boiling alive was not a common method of execution in Tudor England. It was chosen specifically for this case, specifically because it echoed the means of the crime death by a cooking method for a man who had used the kitchen as a weapon. It was theatrical, deliberate cruelty in the service of a legal message. The second is the question of whether Rose actually intended what happened. His claim that it was a joke, a purgative, not a poison, is not necessarily implausible. Food poisoning was common enough in Tudor kitchens that the line between a bad purgative prank and a fatal contamination was genuinely not always clear. Most historians who have examined this case lean toward concluding that Roos was almost certainly guilty of criminal negligence, at worst not calculated murder. But the third and most interesting thing for our story is the political context that surrounded all of this. The victim of the pottage incident, or intended victim, since Fisher himself did not eat, was one of Henry's most prominent opponents on the question of his divorce. And in the weeks following the deaths, rumors circulated at court that Henry himself might have been involved, or that the Boleyn family might have arranged the poisoning. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapoy, who watched Tudor politics with a careful, cynical eye of a seasoned diplomat, noted these rumors in his dispatches. There is no evidence of any royal involvement. None. But the speed and ferocity of Henry's response, the act of Parliament, the retroactive attainder, the choice of execution by boiling looks in this context, less like righteous outrage, and rather more like a man very eager to close down any suggestion that the king might have ordered a cook to do something terrible to a bishop's dinner. History does not give us a clean answer. Here, it gives us a cook who died horribly, a king who moved with extraordinary speed to make an example, and a cloud of political suspicion that never quite dispersed. What the Roos case did to the Tudor kitchen, to the 200 people at Hampton Court, and to kitchen workers across England was change the temperature of the room. Not literally. It was already very hot, but psychologically. Every cook who heard about Richard Roos, every sergeant and yeoman and groom who knew someone who had worked in a noble household and heard this story moved through the court like a cold wind in a hot room. Every one of them understood something more clearly after 1532 than they had before it. The kitchen was not a place where honest mistakes could simply be apologized for and corrected. The kitchen was a place where a mistake, even an accidental one, even one you thought was a harmless prank, could end your life in the most extreme way the law could devise. That awareness must have been constant. It must have shaped how every person in the kitchen moved, checked, double-checked, smelled, tasted, hesitated. And this brings us to the system that existed before food ever reached the king's mouth. Because the Tudor royal household had built over centuries an elaborate protocol of testing designed to detect any form of contamination or deliberate harm before it reached the monarch. A system that the more you examine, it becomes one of the most fascinatingly paranoid, bureaucratic structures in English history. It was called the assay, and it was in its way a small performance of anxiety built into every meal service. Before any food was presented to the king, it had to be tested, Not by one person, by a carefully sequenced series of people, each at a different stage of the food journey from kitchen to table. The historical documents from the mid-15th century describe the process in extraordinary detail, and the Tudor royal household carried forward these same principles. The sequence began in the kitchen itself. The master cook and the lord steward were responsible for the initial testing of the king's food before it left the kitchen, tasting each dish themselves, confirming it was safe to pass along. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was real. The two most senior figures in the food chain personally ate a portion of what they were sending to the king. Then, as the food traveled through the palace toward the table, the testing continued. At each transfer point, a servant performed what was called an assay, a formal tasting of each dish recorded in the court's ceremonial protocols as part of the structured theater of royal service. The cupbearer, the person responsible for the king's drink, had his own specific ritual. He would pour a small amount of the wine into what's called the basin of the testing vessel, and drink it in front of witnesses before the wine was offered to the king. Then he would offer the king's cup already poured, kneeling, always kneeling, because you did not stand at the height of seated king, holding the covered cup, removing the cover, with ceremony wiping the rim with a cloth. But it went further. The cloth itself, the king's personal napkin brought from the linen store, was carried to the table by hanging it around the bearer's neck, specifically so that both hands were visible and the cloth had been in contact with no concealed surface. Once at the table, the carver took the napkin, kissed it, the physical contact being the test, and delivered it to the king. They kissed the napkin, they kissed the tablecloth. Servants were documented kissing the seat cushion of the king's chair before he sat down. If their lips did not swell, if there was no burning, no itch, no immediate reaction, the king could sit. Now, here's the thing I want to point out about all of this ceremonial poison testing. Because it has a flaw so obvious that it should undermine the entire system, and yet everyone seems to have lived with it quite contentedly. Poison does not work immediately. Any arsenic, the most commonly feared poison of the era, would not produce symptoms for hours, sometimes many hours after ingestion, depending on the dose, the person's weight, what else they had eaten, and a dozen other variables. A food taster who swallowed a sublethal dose of arsenic at the start of a meal would show no symptoms at all during that meal, and the king, having watched his tasters eat and observed them to be fine, would proceed happily to eat his own food. The protection offered by the assay against a sophisticated measured poisoning attempt was essentially zero. What the assay protected against was obvious immediate contamination food that tasted wrong, that smelled wrong, that caused visible physical distress in the seconds after consumption. It was a system designed to catch the crude and the careless, not the patient and the skilled. And yet it continued for centuries because, and this is what I find genuinely interesting about it, the assay was not purely a practical safety measure. It was also a performance, a daily formal witness declaration that the king's person was precious enough to require this level of protection, that he was surrounded by people whose literal job description included, eat the king's food first. The paranoia of Henry VIII, in other words, had been institutionalized, ritualized, given a ceremonial form that made it look less like fear and more like majesty. For the kitchen workers at the bottom of this system, the implications of all this were very specific and very practical. First, certain ingredients were physically locked away. The most expensive spices, the saffron, the cinnamon, the pepper, were stored in the spicery and issued in controlled quantities because expensive ingredients were both valuable enough to steal and rare enough that any unexpected addition to a dish would be noticed. The keys were held by the Claire of the kitchen. You did not help yourself. You did not take a handful of pepper home in your pocket. The accounting was too meticulous and the consequences too severe. Second, the testing created a specific culture of caution around anything that went to the king's private kitchen. The dishes prepared by Master Cook John Bricket for Henry VIII personally went through additional scrutiny that the regular kitchen food did not. Every person involved in touching that food knew concretely and specifically that their judgment was the last line of defense between an ordinary meal and a catastrophe. And third, the ruse case had established something that had not been formally stated before. The penalty for something going wrong in the king's food chain was not proportional to intent. It was proportional to outcome. If someone died as a result of what came out of your kitchen, The question of whether you meant it was in Henry VIII England, rather less important than the question of whether you're going to make a satisfyingly dramatic example. That is a terrifying professional environment to operate in. And yet, here's the thing that I keep finding myself returning to across every part of this story. They kept going. Every morning before dawn, the fires were lit. Every day the food arrived through the tradesman's gate. Every service the dishes moved from the kitchen to the serving hatches to the great hall. 200 people showing up doing their jobs, managing their fear alongside their skill, and sending out food that by every historical account was extraordinary. There were no documented large-scale food poisoning outbreaks at Hampton Court. None. The system worked not because the assay was scientifically sound. It was not. Not because the conditions were particularly hygienic by any modern standard. They were not. But because 200 professionals had internalized the gravity of what they were doing and brought their full attention to it every single day. They were afraid and they were good at their jobs. Both things were true simultaneously. Here is a question I want to leave you with because I find it genuinely thought-provoking. We live in an era of food safety regulations, hygiene standards, allergen labeling, refrigeration, and microbiological testing that the Tudor kitchen workers could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. And yet, food safety incidents still happen, recalls still happen, contaminations still happen despite all of that infrastructure. The Tudor royal kitchen with no refrigeration, no laboratory testing, no formal food, safety law, just meticulous human attention, rigid hierarchy, personal accountability, and the extremely motivating awareness of what happened to Richard Roos, managed to feed a court of 200 people twice a day for decades without a single documented mass poisoning incident. Human attention when the stakes are high enough turns out to be remarkably effective. That is maybe worth remembering the next time you get distracted while making dinner. The fear of what could go wrong inside the kitchen was one layer of pressure that shaped daily life in that world. But there was a second kind of pressure, one that came not from inside those walls, but from an order that could arrive from above at almost any moment with no warning whatsoever. An order that meant the entire operation, all 55 rooms, all 200 people, all the fires and all the pots and all the carefully managed supply chains had to stop, pack up, move, and somehow be fully operational again at a palace 20, 30, 50 miles away within days. That story, the story of what happened when the Tudor kitchen went on the road, is something else entirely. And it is coming up very soon. Picture this for a moment. You've been working at Hampton Court for 3 years. You know every corner of the kitchen complex. You know which fire burns hottest by the afternoon. Which section of the stone floor turns slippery when the condensation from the boiling house rolls through the passage at midday. Which sergeant you can approach if something goes wrong, and which one you absolutely cannot. The kitchen with all its noise and heat and hierarchy has become, in the only real sense of that word, your home. And then one morning in late spring, the news moves through the palace like a current of cool air. The king is leaving. The progress has been announced, and in the space of a few weeks the entire operation, every fire, every pot, every carefully arranged department of the kitchen complex has to pack up, disperse, and follow. The royal progress was one of the defining rhythms of Tudor life, and it is one of the aspects of this world that modern people consistently underestimate in terms of what it actually meant logistically, humanly, physically for the people who had to make it work. Here is the basic historical fact. Henry VIII was almost always moving. He had over 60 residences, palaces, manor houses, hunting lodges, ecclesiastical properties he'd acquired or borrowed, and he moved between them with a regularity that to a modern person would suggest either extreme restlessness or a deeply complicated relationship with the concept of being home. The formal summer progress happened annually, usually beginning in June. The court's travel itinerary, the historical records call it the gist, was published 5 months in advance, giving organizers time to prepare each destination along the route. But Henry also moved throughout the rest of the year, and the full court could number anywhere from 750 to 500 people, depending on the season, who Henry's current wife was, and how many of the extended household had been summoned to attend. Why did they move so often? The official explanations were political, to show the king's face to his subjects, to connect with local nobility, to make alliances, to demonstrate the living presence of royal authority across the realm. And all of that was true. But the historian who reads the practical records of what was left behind at Hampton Court when the court departed arrives at a rather less glamorous explanation. After 4 to 6 weeks of 1,200 people eating, sleeping, cooking, and existing in one place without modern plumbing, without modern waste disposal, without any technology for managing the sheer biological output of 1,000 human bodies and their animals, the palace became, not to put too fine a point on it, unlivable. The brick chambers under the great house of Ammon. Hampton Court's communal toilet facility, which could accommodate 14 people at a time, well, by Simon Thurley's estimate in his research on the palace, filled to head height within 4 weeks of the court's arrival. Head height. In an underground chamber the size of a large room. The walls of corridors and courtyards would be stained with urine because, in the absence of sufficient toilet facilities, people used any available vertical surface. Henry had large red cross marks painted on the worst offending spots, hoping the religious symbol would deter people from relieving themselves there. It did not work. It just gave people something to aim for. The accumulated grime from constant fires from cooking from hundreds of bodies in enclosed spaces. The palace walls would turn nearly black with soot and grease in just a few weeks. The court did not move because Henry was restless. The court moved because the palace had to be emptied before it could be cleaned. And the cleaning, the scrubbing, the airing, the removal of waste, the fumigation with burned spices to replace the smell of several hundred people with something more acceptable took weeks. By the time the court was ready to return, the palace that had seemed impossibly crowded was almost pleasant again. This was the actual engine of the royal progress, not politics, or not only politics, sanitation. The movement of 1,000 people was at its most fundamental level a waste management strategy. And what did that mean for the kitchen? Think about what we have built up over the past 7 parts of this story. The 55 rooms, the 19 departments, the supply chain of water and meat and spices and wine, the carefully cultivated relationships with contractors, the stocks of seasoned wood, the fish ponds, the carefully maintained fire system. All of that infrastructure was fixed. It was built into the stone of Hampton Court. It existed there and nowhere else. When the progress was called, the kitchen could not move. But the court could not eat from a kitchen that had stayed behind. This created one of the most extraordinary logistical challenges in Tudor household management. And the solution reveals something fascinating about how the Tudor system actually functioned. What traveled with the progress was not the Hampton Court kitchen. It was a version of it, a mobile echo assembled from portable equipment, temporary structures, and a subset of the kitchen staff who would go where the king went and produce in whatever facilities existed at the destination. Something approximating the standard the court expected. A smaller traveling kitchen, a kitchen in miniature, deployed in manor houses, in bishops' palaces, in hunting lodges, in the houses of noblemen who'd been informed 5 months in advance that the king was coming to stay, and who were expected to have appropriate facilities ready on pain of considerable social and sometimes financial embarrassment. Imagine being one of those noble hosts. The guest arrives with your name and dates on it. The king will be staying at your home for, let us say, 5 days in August. You have 5 months to prepare. And what the preparation involves is not just making up guest rooms and stocking the wine cellar, though both of those are necessary. It is rebuilding or substantially upgrading your kitchen to handle the volume of food that Henry VIII court requires. Stocking supplies on a scale you normally would never need. Hiring additional kitchen staff or borrowing them from neighboring households. Managing the expectations of a monarch who were accustomed to the best food in England, served with the ceremony and precision of a 55-room professional operation twice a day. The historical records show that this often ruined people, not occasionally or dramatically, but quietly and persistently. Noble families who received the king's progress more than once or twice in the course of Henry's reign sometimes emerged from those visits with their finances substantially damaged by the cost of hosting him. The honor of the royal visit was enormous. The cost was commensurate for the kitchen workers who traveled with the progress. The experience was an exercise in professional improvisation. You were expected to maintain standards, the quality of the food, the presentation, the ceremony of service in kitchens that were not designed for this purpose. With equipment that was not your own, with supply chains, you had to establish afresh at each location with local contractors you'd never worked with before. And you had to do all of this while maintaining the hierarchy, the assay protocols, The careful assay of the king's food at every step in a strange kitchen where none of the normal landmarks applied. This required not just skill, but a particular kind of professional adaptability that I suspect was among the most valued and least acknowledged qualities in the Tudor kitchen workforce. Now, there's one event in the entire history of the Tudor progress that stands above all others as an illustration of just how extreme this mobile kitchen challenge could get. June of 1520. Northern France near the town of Gouin and the village of Balingham close to Killala, which was at this point in history still English territory. Henry VIII and Francis I, King of France, are meeting for a summit that has been in preparation for over a year, and that will become one of the most famous diplomatic spectacles in European history. The Field of Cloth of Gold. An estimated 12,000 people attended. Not just the two kings and their immediate courts. 12,000. The combined households of two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe assembled in a field in northern France for 18 days of feasting, jousting, music tournaments, and diplomatic display on a scale that strained the imagination of everyone who witnessed it. Henry built a temporary palace for the occasion. Not a camp, not an arrangement of tents, a palace 100 m on each side, constructed from timber and canvas that has been painted to look like stone and tiles, complete with a courtyard, a chapel, glass windows, an architectural deception so convincing that contemporary accounts describe visitors being unsure whether it was real masonry. And it had a kitchen, a temporary kitchen built in a field in France that had to produce food at a scale and quality befitting a royal court for 18 consecutive days. The English food accounts for the Field of Cloth of Gold are staggering. They brought nearly 200,000 L of wine and 66,000 L of beer, 98,000 eggs, more than 2,000 sheep, 13 swans, 3 porpoises. Some of this ran through a working wine fountain erected in the middle of the temporary palace grounds. You could literally walk up to a fountain and fill your cup with wine. A working wine fountain in a field in France for a diplomatic summit. And behind all of that spectacle in the temporary kitchens erected specifically for this event, a team of cooks were working in conditions that were by any measure extraordinarily challenging. Open-air fires. No permanent infrastructure supply lines that stretch back across the English Channel, and the absolute requirement that the King of England's food be not 1 degree below the standard he expected at Hampton Court. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you had been one of those cooks of the Field of Cloth of Gold, working in a canvas kitchen in a French field, producing food for 12,000 people over 18 days, knowing that the two most powerful kings in Europe were sitting down to your work twice a day, what would that have felt like? I think it would have felt like the most terrifying, and also in some deeper sense, the most exhilarating thing you had ever done in your life. The ultimate test of everything you had learned in those years of service. The moment when all the hierarchy and the discipline and the accumulated professional knowledge compressed into the specific, irreducible question, can you do this here and now under these conditions? The historical record strongly suggests they could. There are no accounts of the English culinary arrangements at the Field of Cloth of Gold failing, no reports of Henry being served inadequate food, no diplomatic disasters arising from a kitchen error. Somehow, in a temporary palace in a French field, the mobile version of the Tudor kitchen performed after a progress ended. Whether a summer tour of the English home counties or the extraordinary spectacle at Jean, the court returned to Hampton Court. And when they did, they came back to a palace that had been cleaned, aired, fumigated with burned herbs and spices, restocked with fresh supplies. The records describe how the rooms prepared for each queen's arrival were perfumed, specifically rose water, fennel water cloves, burned in perfume pans, the scent filling the chambers before the royal party arrived. A kind of olfactory welcome mat, the smell of arrival of freshness of the palace, remembering what it was supposed to be. And the kitchen, too, would come back to life. The fires would be rebuilt from scratch. The deliveries would resume. The clerks of the green cloth would position themselves at their table in the courtyard. The sergeant of the pastry would unlock his ovens. The spit racks would be refitted, and the first pieces of meat would go onto the iron spars and begin to turn. The same operation as always, the same 55 rooms, the same 200 people, the same rhythm of 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon twice a day. But the workers who had traveled with the progress knew something about themselves that they had not quite known before. They knew they could do it without the building, that the kitchen was not the rooms or the fireplaces, or the fish ponds. The kitchen was the people. The knowledge was in their hands. The systems were in their heads. Wherever the king went, they could rebuild it from scratch and make it work. That is a kind of mastery that I find genuinely moving. The ability to carry your whole expertise on your person, to set it up in a new place, to make it function under conditions nobody had planned for, and to send the king's food to the table on time. The progress also illuminated something about the kitchen's relationship to the world beyond Hampton Court's walls, something that most kitchen workers would have glimpsed only occasionally in the ordinary course of their duties. The England they moved through on progress was not the England of the court. It was poorer, quieter, slower, more fragile. Ordinary people watched the royal baggage trains pass the carts piled high with what historians call progress stuff, the furniture and tapestries and kitchen equipment, and 1,000 other necessaries of royal life on the move. And what they saw was a world so entirely different from their own as to be almost incomprehensible. The kitchen worker riding in one of those carts headed to the next stop on the itinerary was not a wealthy person. But he was fed. He was part of a system. He had skill and rank, and a defined place in a structure that for all its harshness had given him something that the people watching from the roadside did not have: a destination. The progress was one of the ways the Tudor kitchen world brushed up against the larger world outside it. But there was another more intimate boundary that we have not yet really examined, a boundary within the kitchen itself between the world of men and the world of women. Because for all that we have talked about 200 workers in 55 rooms, there is something significant that has been hiding in plain sight throughout this entire story. Something that becomes visible only when you look at who is absent from the records. Almost every worker we have discussed, every sergeant, every master cook, every spit worker and scullion and yeoman has been a man. At Hampton Court's great kitchens, there were effectively no women employed. And yet without women, the Tudor food world could not have existed at all. That story, the invisible half of this entire history, is where we're going next. All right, let us be honest about something that has been hiding in this story from the very beginning. We have spent 8 parts of this journey inside one of the most remarkable food operations in the history of England. We have walked through 55 rooms, climbed the hierarchy from spit worker to master cook, followed supply chains across continents, ridden on the back of a cart to the field of cloth of gold. We have talked about 200 workers, their ambitions and their fear, their skill and their survival. And almost every single one of those workers has been male. That is not an accident of storytelling. It is an accurate reflection of the historical record. The great kitchens at Hampton Court were, by the documentary evidence, we've almost entirely staffed by men. There were no women employed in the formal kitchen hierarchy at Hampton Court. Not in the great kitchen. Not in the boiling house. Not turning spits. Not scrubbing pots in the scullery. 200 men producing 600 to 800 meals a day in the world's most sophisticated royal kitchen. And yet, here is the part that actually stops me every time I think about it. None of that kitchen, none of those men, none of those 55 rooms existed in isolation from the other half of the Tudor food world. The half that was entirely female, entirely essential, and almost completely invisible in the official historical record. Let me tell you about the other kitchen. Not the one with 6 fireplaces and master cooks and the clerk of the green cloth. The other one, the one that fed the overwhelming majority of people in England in 1530. The one that operated without any of the hierarchy or the ceremony or the architectural sophistication of Hampton Court, but that produced across millions of households, simultaneously the actual daily food of the actual English nation. That kitchen was run by a woman almost always in the homes of ordinary Tudor families, of farmers, of craftsmen, of merchants, of yeomen, of anyone who did not have the good fortune or the misfortune, depending on your perspective, of being part of the royal court. Cooking was fundamentally and almost entirely a female domain, not because women were considered particularly gifted at it, or because it was viewed as artistically fulfilling work, because it was labor, and labor was allocated by gender in the Tudor world with the same uncompromising clarity that it was allocated by rank. Men worked the land, managed animals, conducted trade, defended the household. Women managed the interior, and managing the interior meant, among a great many other things, managing food. What did that actually mean in practice? The historian Alison Sim, whose research on the Tudor housewife is among the most thorough we have on ordinary women's lives in this period, describes a world of extraordinary, and largely unacknowledged complexity. A Tudor housewife of even modest means was not simply someone who cooked dinner. She was the household's nutritionist, pharmacist, brewmaster, preservationist, and food scientist, all without a title, without pay beyond the shelter and maintenance of her marriage, and without any formal recognition that what she was doing required genuine skill. Let us start with bread, because bread was the foundation of everything. In a middle-class Tudor household, a woman baked bread, not occasionally, not as a special project on weekends. Bread was made regularly because a working adult man could consume an entire loaf at a single meal, one full loaf per person per meal. The daily production demands were enormous, and the process measuring grains, sieving flour, mixing dough, letting it rise, managing the temperature of a brick oven that had to be preheated with fire, then cleared of ash, then loaded with bread at exactly the right moment, was a multi-hour technical process that required not just effort, but practiced accurate judgment. A woman who could bake consistent, well-written, properly cooked bread was doing something that took real skill to learn and real attention to maintain. The Tudor world did not particularly acknowledge this. The bread was expected. If it was good, that was normal. If it was bad, that was a problem. Beyond bread, there was the ale. This is perhaps the detail of the Tudor housewife's kitchen life that most surprises modern readers, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment. In a vast majority of Tudor households, the woman of the house was also the household's brewer. Everyone in Tudor England drank ale, not occasionally, not as a treat constantly throughout the day at every meal, including children. Water was genuinely not safe to drink in most places, contaminated with the kind of biological material that made a regular source of illness. Ale, which had been fermented and therefore had its microbiological content largely neutralized, was the safe beverage. It was weak by modern standards. Most of the ale that ordinary people drank was what was called small ale, low in alcohol content, more like a thin, fermented grain drink. But it was ubiquitous, and the housewife made it. The brewing process required understanding fermentation, managing temperatures, knowing when the ale was ready, knowing when it had gone off. It was chemistry applied, intuitively passed down from mother to daughter through generations of practical instruction. It was also, practically speaking, a business responsibility because ale could be made in excess and sold commercially, and many Tudor housewives supplemented the family income through the ale they brewed beyond what the household consumed. The word wife, a woman who brewed and sold ale, appears in documents throughout the medieval and Tudor periods, and it was not a diminutive title. It described a real commercial role that women occupied with significant authority. And then there was preservation. In a world without refrigeration, keeping food safe was not a background task. It was a central, skilled, seasonally critical responsibility that could mean the difference between adequate nutrition through a winter and genuine hardship. A farmer's wife, as the historical record consistently describes, cured bacon, salted meat, smoked fish, made pickles, prepared conserves of fruit, dried herbs rendered fat for storage, and organized the household's food stores so that what was available in summer would, through careful management, stretch into February and March, when fresh supplies were still months away. This required knowledge, not book knowledge. There were no textbooks available to ordinary Tudor women, and most of them could not read in any case. It required the transmitted embodied knowledge of practice, which cuts of meat salted well, and which dried out how much salt was enough, and how much made the meat inedible, which fruits preserved best in sugar or honey, and which fermented better than they kept. Knowledge that had been developed over generations, and that passed not through writing, but through the teaching of daughters by mothers of young brides, by older women in the communities they married into. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a second. We have spent a lot of this story admiring, and I mean that genuinely, the professional expertise of the Tudor kitchen workers at Hampton Court, the master cook who produced perfect roasted venison for a king without a thermometer, the confectionery workers who built cathedrals from sugar paste, the Claire of the kitchen who managed 200 people in 19 departments simultaneously. All of that expertise was recognized. It was ranked and titled and paid, however modestly. It moved upward through a hierarchy. It was recorded in the administrative documents of the royal household. It left traces in history. Now consider the farmer's wife who spent 40 years doing something equally complex, equally skilled, equally essential, and whose expertise left almost no trace whatsoever. Because it was expected, because it was domestic, because it was what women did, and what women did was not particularly worth writing down. I'm not making a political argument here, or not only one. I am making a historical observation. The Tudor food world was absolutely bifurcated along gender lines. In the female half of that world, the half that fed the actual majority of English people every day, has been systematically underrepresented in the historical record precisely because the people doing it were not part of any institution that generated documents. The Clare of the green cloth generated documents. The Tudor housewife's knowledge existed in her hands, and her habits, and her conversation with her daughters. And when she died, much of it died with her. There was one area of the food world, though, where women's authority was so complete and so genuinely valued that even the records acknowledge it, and that was the banqueting stuff. We talked in part 6 about the spectacular sweet courses that mark the end of formal Tudor feasts, the sugar sculptures, the marzipan subtleties, the elaborate confections. At the royal level, these were produced by professional male confectioners in the confectionery at Hampton Court. But in the middle-class household, in the homes of the merchants and the gentry, and the lesser nobility, these sweet preparations were not the province of hired cooks. They were considered the personal responsibility of the woman of the house. Historian Alison Sim notes this specifically in her work on Tudor food. The making of what the period called banqueting stuff was a task that fell to the lady of the house herself, not to servants. It was considered a refined and personal expression of her hospitality. Why? Because sugar and sweet preparations were understood in Tudor medical thinking as medicinal. Sweetened preparations, candied fruits. Sugar-work spiced preserves were seen as beneficial for digestion, for mood, for the general balance of the body's humors, and medicine was a woman's domain. This is one of the most fascinating things I have encountered in researching this story. In the Tudor world, women were the primary domestic medical practitioners. Not trained physicians, those were men, and they were expensive and relatively rare. But the day-to-day management of household health, the knowledge of which herbs helped, with which ailments, which preparations soothed, which symptoms, which foods promoted, which outcomes in the body, this was considered a female area of expertise. The housewife's doctor was not a metaphor. It was a real and recognized role. And because sugar was medicine, making sweetened preparations was medical work. And medical work in the home was done by women. The result was that Tudor women of the middle and upper classes developed genuine expertise in confectionery. Not identical to the confectionery at Hampton Court, which was on an entirely different scale, but drawing on the same principles of working with sugar, almonds, fruit, and spice to produce things that were both beautiful and therapeutically appropriate. There is a story attached to Hampton Court itself that captures this intersection of women's sweets and the royal court, though historians are divided about exactly how much of it is true. The maids of honor tarts, small curd cheese, tarts delicate and fragrant that have been made in the town of Richmond near Hampton Court for centuries. One version of their origin story goes like this. Henry VIII, walking in the gardens of Hampton Court, encountered a group of Catherine of Aragon's ladies in waiting who were making these little tarts for their own amusement. A group activity, exactly the kind of sweet preparation that Tudor women of noble status engaged in as both social pleasure and domestic duty. Henry tasted one and was so taken by it that he named them after the women who made them and had the recipe locked in an iron box for the exclusive use of the royal family. The historical record is skeptical of parts of this story. Curd tarts of this kind predate the Tudor period by centuries, and the Hampton Court connection is probably more legend than documented fact. But even as legend, the story reveals something real about the cultural landscape of the time. It was entirely plausible to a Tudor audience that ladies-in-waiting would be making sweet tarts for their own pleasure in a palace garden. That was a completely normal and expected activity for women of that social standing. The story only works because the activity is realistic. What I find most interesting about all of this, and I've been thinking about this for longer than I probably should, is the structural contrast. At Hampton Court, cooking was public, professional, institutionalized, hierarchical, and male. It was a career. It had ranks and wages and a documented history. It was, in a very real sense, taken seriously as work. In the ordinary Tudor household, cooking was private, domestic, diffuse, largely invisible and female. It had no ranks, no wages in any formal sense, no documented history. It was in a very real sense taken for granted. And yet, in terms of actual impact on the lives of actual English people, the domestic kitchen was the more important of the two. Hampton Court fed 1,200 members of the royal court. The domestic kitchens of England fed 4 million people. The women who ran those kitchens were in aggregate doing something that the royal household could not even begin to replicate, sustaining the food security of an entire nation household by season with no infrastructure, no supply chain, no clerk of the green cloth, and no recognition. I do not think it is possible to tell the story of the Tudor kitchen honestly without acknowledging this. The two worlds were not separate. They were dependent on each other in ways that neither fully acknowledged. And there is one more dimension of the female food world I want to mention before we move on, because it connects the domestic kitchen directly to the larger story of disease survival and the fragility of life in the Tudor period. The Tudor housewife's knowledge of preservation and medicine was not abstract. It operated in the context of a world where food-related illness was common, where spoilage was a constant threat, where bad decisions about storing or preparing food could make an entire family seriously ill or worse. The skills of preservation and the skills of medical treatment from food plants were survival skills in the most literal sense. And they were exercised every day by millions of women whose names we do not know, whose recipes were never written down, whose expertise was never formalized or ranked or paid. They just did it season after season, household after household, across a landscape of farms and towns and villages that Hampton Court Palace could fit inside 100 times. Now, here's something I've been building toward across this entire part of the story, and I want to name it directly. The Tudor kitchen, both the royal one we've been exploring and the domestic one we've just described, was fundamentally shaped by a world that was more precarious, more physically demanding, and more contingent on constant human attention than anything most of us will ever experience. Both the royal kitchen worker and the ordinary Tudor housewife shared something essential: the knowledge that the food had to work. It had to be safe. It had to nourish. There was no margin for error that could be easily absorbed. If the food failed, people got sick. If people got sick in a world without modern medicine, they often died. The stakes of cooking in 1530 were genuinely higher than the stakes of cooking in the 21st century. And the people who managed these stakes day after day in conditions of extraordinary hardship, both the 200 men in the royal kitchens and the millions of women managing homes across England, deserve a story told about them. But speaking of things failing and speaking of the precariousness of life in this world, there is one dimension of the Tudor kitchen story that we have circled around without going directly into its heart. What happened when the body of a kitchen worker gave out? What was the real human cost? Not just the burns and the damaged hands we have mentioned, but the deep structural physical toll of decades in these conditions, and what was happening in the world outside the kitchen walls that made the interior of Hampton Court, for all its heat and hierarchy, genuinely the safer option. The sweating sickness, the plague years, the particular ways that the Tudor body broke down under the demands of this life. We have talked about fear. We've talked about discipline. We've talked about work. We have not yet really talked about what it meant to be a mortal human being inside this world. And that conversation is next. There is a phrase that appears in a letter written to Henry VIII in the summer of 1528. It was written by the French ambassador, Cardinal Dudley, who was watching the sweating sickness tear through London with the clinical, slightly horrified detachment of someone who had been fortunate enough not to catch it yet. He wrote, "This disease is the easiest in the world to die of. One morning you are fine. By evening you have a headache, then a sudden sense of dread, then shivering, then fever, then a drenching sweat that soaks everything you are wearing. And then within a day, you're either recovering or you are gone. No middle stage, no lingering, no time to arrange your affairs or say your goodbyes or understand what had happened to you." Tudor England lived alongside death in a way that most of us today genuinely cannot imagine. But in the summer of 1528, that proximity became something else. It became emergency. And in the royal kitchen complex at Hampton Court, it became something that changed the lives and ended the lives of real people who were just trying to do their jobs. The sweating sickness, known in Tudor England as the English sweat or in Latin as the Tudor Anglicus, is one of history's most haunting medical mysteries. It appeared in England in 1585, shortly after Henry Tudor arrived to fight at the Battle of Bosworth Field so suddenly and so lethally that it killed several thousand Londoners within a matter of weeks before disappearing. It returned in 1507, 1517, 1528, and finally 1551, and then it vanished from history so completely that modern scientists still cannot definitively identify what it was. The symptoms were extraordinary in their speed. A contemporary physician named John Keyes, who observed the 1551 outbreak at close quarters and wrote what is now considered the definitive contemporary account, described the progression in stages. First a sense of apprehension, then violent cold shivers, then headache, weakness, pain in the neck and shoulders. Then the sweating began, profuse, saturating, unstoppable, accompanied by fever, rapid heartbeat, delirium, intense thirst. In the final stage, an overwhelming heaviness and the desperate desire to sleep. After 24 hours, you were either dead or clearly recovering. The window was that narrow. What made the sweating sickness particularly frightening beyond its speed was its apparent selectivity. It struck the young and the strong most often, not the elderly, not the very young, not the already weakened. The disease seemed to have a particular appetite for people in the prime of their lives, the healthy and the robust. In parish death records from the outbreak years, more than 80% of burials from sweating sickness were men, not women, young men, middle-aged men. The exact population most heavily represented in the Tudor kitchen workforce. The 1528 outbreak is the one most directly connected to Hampton Court's history, and it deserves some time. In late May of that year, the disease appeared in London and spread with terrifying speed. Henry VIII, who had a documented, intense, and entirely rational fear of illness throughout his reign, responded immediately. He broke up the court. He left London. He began moving from house to house in the countryside, reportedly sleeping in a different bed every night to avoid lingering infection, covering as many as 12 miles in a single day when he heard that a case had appeared at the household where he had just been staying. One of the people sent to Hampton Court during this crisis was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who was instructed to continue managing government business while Henry fled further into the countryside. Wolsey moved into the palace, and showing what history must acknowledge as considerable personal courage for a man of his age and considerable girth, continued working. He then caught the sweating sickness himself. He survived, but he wrote Henry a letter during his illness that reflects both the terror of the moment and the particular quality of Tudor's self-awareness about death. He told the king that if this proved to be the last letter he ever wrote, Henry should know he had always been served by a faithful man. Wolsey recovered, but others at court that summer did not. In Berlin, who was at that point still the object of Henry's obsessive pursuit, and not yet his queen, fell ill while staying at Heather Castle in Kent. Henry, who was reportedly devastated by the news, but not so devastated that he was willing to go to her, sent his personal physician, William Butts, one of the best medical practitioners in England, to treat her, and survived. Her brother-in-law, William Carey, did not. He died on the 22nd of June, 1528, leaving his children without a father. Thomas Cromwell's wife, Elizabeth, died of the sweating sickness. So did his daughters Grace and Anne. In one summer, Thomas Cromwell lost his wife and both of his daughters. Now the royal court, the courtiers, the senior members of the household, their experiences are documented. Their names survive. Their letters survive. We know who got sick, who recovered, who was bereaved. What about the kitchen workers? Here is the honest and uncomfortable truth we do not know. The historical record does not particularly track what happened to individual workers. At the bottom of the Hampton Court hierarchy during epidemic years, the names of the people who turned the spits and scrubbed the pots and carried wood for the fires are for the most part not recorded. But we can reason about their exposure with some confidence. The sweating sickness struck men disproportionately. It struck people who lived communally in close proximity, sharing sleeping spaces. It struck by the evidence of the parish records people engaged in physical labor, and the 200 workers in the kitchen complex at Hampton Court were all of those things simultaneously. Men living communally, many of them sleeping in and around the kitchen rooms themselves, as we've established, doing intensely physical work. If the disease had any particular mechanism of spread related to close living quarters and physical exertion, and the historical record suggests it thrived in exactly those conditions, then the kitchen complex at Hampton Court would have been one of the most vulnerable environments in England during an outbreak. Do I know that kitchen workers died in the 1528 epidemic? Not with the individual specificity that I can document for William Carey or Thomas Cromwell's family. But the logic of the situation makes it nearly certain that the community of people living and working in those 55 rooms did not emerge from the worst epidemic of Henry VII's reign entirely unscathed. The sweating sickness was the most dramatic health threat that hung over the Tudor kitchen world. But it was not the only one, and some of the quieter threats were in their own way just as insidious. Let me talk about the fires. We have discussed the fires throughout this story in terms of what they produced. The heat needed to cook the logs consumed the spit workers' endurance. But a fire that burns for 6 to 8 tons of wood every day is not just a cooking tool. It is a respiratory environment. The smoke from those 6 great fireplaces in the great kitchen, from the boiling house copper, from the bakehouse ovens, all of that smoke had to go somewhere. Hampton Court did have chimneys, which is more than many comparable structures of the era. But the efficiency of 16th-century chimney systems was limited. The smoke that didn't rise cleanly up and out of the building dispersed through the kitchen rooms, through the passages, through the working spaces where people spent 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Chronic smoke inhalation over years of kitchen service would produce exactly what you would expect it to produce: respiratory damage. Persistent coughs, impaired lung function, shortened capacity for the physical exertion that the job demanded. There was no medical framework in 1530 for understanding what was happening to a long-serving kitchen worker's lungs. No diagnosis that matched what we would now call chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from occupational smoke exposure. There was just a man who coughed more than he used to, who tired more easily than he had in his 20s, whose body was slowly accumulating the cost of years spent in the proximity of industrial fire. And then there was the metal. The Tudor kitchen worked with a range of metal vessels that we now know to be biologically significant in ways that nobody in the 16th century understood. Bronze pots used for cooking contain copper, and when food is left to cool in bronze vessels, the acid in the food can leach copper into the contents. The people who worked at Hampton Court in the restored kitchens in recent decades specifically noted this hazard. You do not let food cool in the bronze cooking vessels because of the risk of copper contamination. The pewter plates and vessels used by the court contained lead. Pewter in this period was an alloy of tin and lead, and it was everywhere in the Tudor dining world, from the plates of the lower court members to the serving vessels used across the household. Chronic low-level lead exposure through food repeatedly prepared and served in lead-containing vessels would accumulate in the body over time, producing effects on the nervous system, cognition, and physical health that were entirely invisible to the people experiencing them. Nobody in 1530 knew about lead poisoning as a medical concept. They would not have recognized the symptoms as occupationally induced. They would have experienced them as ordinary bodily decline, as getting older, as the body naturally wearing down, which in a sense it was just faster and with specific help from the chemistry of their workplace. Here is the question I genuinely find difficult, and I want to be honest about that difficulty. When you add up all of these factors, the smoke inhalation, the lead exposure, the physical demands of the work, the risk of burns and injuries, the proximity to disease and communal living conditions, the nutritional quality of the food that the lower workers received compared to what they were producing. What was the life expectancy of someone who spent 20 years in the lower ranks of the Hampton Court kitchen? I cannot give you a precise number because the historical record does not offer one. The demographic data for Tudor working people, especially those at the lower levels of service, is fragmentary and contested. What I can tell you is that life expectancy for working people in Tudor England was shorter than for the wealthy and shorter than for those with access to cleaner environments and better nutrition. That is not a controversial statement. It is simply true. A man who entered the kitchen as a young worker rose to groom or yeoman over a decade of service and worked his way toward a sergeant's role. That man was spending the prime years of his life in conditions that modern occupational health standards would flag as seriously hazardous in multiple independent categories. He was doing it by choice because the alternatives were worse, and I think that is worth sitting with. I want to tell you about one more dimension of this because it connects the individual human reality to the larger historical picture in a way that I find genuinely moving. The sweating sickness disappeared completely. Finally, in 1551, the last outbreak, and then it never came back. 5 centuries later, scientists still debate what it was. Proposals have ranged from a form of hunter virus to a particularly virulent influenza strain to something entirely novel. And there is still no definitive answer. Something killed thousands of Tudor people, many of them young and healthy, with extraordinary speed and efficiency. It threatened Henry VIII personally enough that he reorganized his entire life around avoiding it for decades. It killed Thomas Cromwell's family. It nearly killed in Berlin. It swept through the communities of servants and workers who had no ability to flee to the countryside or send for their personal physicians. And then it simply stopped as mysteriously as it had arrived. The workers who survived the 1528 epidemic, who kept the kitchen running even as the court broke up around them, who continued stoking fires and turning spits and producing food in a palace that had been partially evacuated. Those workers had done something that the historical record doesn't particularly acknowledge. They had stayed in the most dangerous place in England in the worst summer of the sweating sickness epidemic. 200 men had remained at their posts and kept the machine running, not because they were heroic in any dramatic sense, because it was their job, and leaving was not a realistic option for people at their level of the hierarchy. But they survived it. They came out the other side. The fires kept burning. The food kept moving through the serving hatches. Now, I want to ask you something personal, something that has been building in me across this whole conversation. We have spent a lot of time talking about what was hard about life in the Tudor kitchen. And it was hard. Genuinely, deeply, substantially hard. The heat, the hierarchy, the disease, the danger, the invisibility, the precarity. None of that is exaggerated. But there is something else that I keep noticing in the record. Something quieter that sits alongside all of that difficulty. The people in the Tudor kitchen were not just surviving. They were creating something. Every day, twice a day, they were producing food that by every account was genuinely extraordinary in its quality and ambition. They were part of a system that, for all its cruelty and inequality, was doing something that had never been done before at that scale, with that sophistication in the history of England. And I think there's a reason why people stayed. Not just because leaving was hard, because being part of something that large, that skilled, that consequential, even when you are at the bottom of it, even when your name will never be recorded, even when the man whose meals you make will never know you exist. There is something in that participation that matters to people. Work matters to people. Being good at what you do matters to people. Being part of a thing that works matters to people. That has not changed in 500 years. The sweating sickness, the respiratory damage, the quiet erosion of health through lead and smoke and overwork. These are the dark threads woven through this story. They are real and they deserve acknowledgement. But they are not the whole story. The whole story includes the people who survived, who grew old in the kitchen or who left the kitchen and went on to other lives, who passed their knowledge to the next generation of grooms and yeomen and sergeants, keeping the whole remarkable chain of expertise alive. And it includes what that kitchen ultimately became, not just in the years of Henry VIII, but in the 2 centuries after his death, when the same fires kept burning, the same rooms, kept operating the same tradition of professional cooking, kept accumulating knowledge and skill and invention. Because here's the thing that I find most extraordinary about the entire Tudor kitchen story. The thing that pulls all of these threads together into something larger than any one of them on its own. The kitchen at Hampton Court did not die with Henry VIII in 1547. It kept going. The Stuart monarchs used it. The Georgian monarchs used it. The kitchens that Henry VIII built and staffed and organized continued operating as a living, working institution for 200 years after his death. 200 years. And during that entire time, the knowledge developed in those 55 rooms, the craft, the techniques, the organizational principles, the professional culture was flowing outward into the rest of the food world, shaping what came after, shaping in ways that are direct and traceable the professional kitchens that exist today. That is not a small legacy. That is an enormous one. And we are very nearly at the end of our time together. Close enough that I think it's time to finally ask the question that this whole story has been building toward. What did all of it mean? What is the inheritance of those 200 men in those 55 rooms? What did the Tudor kitchen actually give to the world? That answer, the real answer, the one that connects 1530 to right now, is coming up very soon. Somewhere in the late summer of 1737, George II, the last monarch who would ever live at Hampton Court Palace, packed his belongings and left. The court departed. The courtiers followed. The servants dispersed to other postings, other palaces, other lives, and the 55 rooms in the north wing of Hampton Court fell quiet for the first time in over 200 years. The fires went out. 2 centuries of continuous fire. From a moment Henry VIII had those 6 great fireplaces roaring in 1529 to the day George II household finally moved on, the kitchen complex at Hampton Court had never been fully dark, never been fully cold, never gone a single day without producing food for someone. That is a continuity so remarkable it is difficult to fully absorb. Think about what 200 years means. Between 1529 and 1737, England went through 6 monarchs after Henry Edward V, sixth, Mary I, Elizabeth I, James I, Charles I, Oliver Cromwell briefly and informally, Charles II, James II, William and Mary Anne, and then George II. The country had a civil war executed. A king briefly became a republic, survived a plague that killed a quarter of London in 1665, and rebuilt after the Great Fire of London in 1666. Through all of it, the kitchen kept going. Now, here's what I want to think through with you, because it connects the world we've spent so much time inside to the world we actually live in today. When the history books credit Auguste Escoffier, the brilliant French chef who in the 1890s at the Savoy Hotel in London formalized what we now call the Brigade de Cuisine system with inventing modern professional kitchen organization, they are telling an important truth. Essier's contribution was enormous and real. He codified, systematized, and brought disciplined documentation to a set of principles that had previously existed more as practice than as formal theory. But here's what those history books tend to skip over. Essier did not invent the idea of a kitchen divided into specialized departments, each under a skilled leader feeding hundreds of people a day with consistent quality and organized efficiency. That idea was alive and functioning at Hampton Court in 1530. The sergeant of the pastry overseeing a team of specialists who produced nothing but pastry. The sergeant of the spicery responsible for nothing but the spices. The master cook whose only job was the king's food. The clerk of the kitchen who managed the whole operations accounts and personnel. The carefully structured ladder from groom to lineman to sergeant to master cook. Each step requiring demonstrated competence before advancement. What Escoffier called the Brigade de Cuisine. What he described as a military-inspired hierarchy of specialized roles with clear chains of command. The Tudor kitchen had been operating that system for 350 years before he was born. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because the history is more complicated than a simple straight line. The professional kitchens of Escoffier's era were not directly descended from Hampton Court. There were centuries of intervening development. French culinary influenced the rise of restaurants as a social institution after the French Revolution, the emergence of the hotel industry. All of these things shaped what a professional kitchen looked like by the 1890s. But the fundamental insight that cooking at scale requires specialization hierarchy, clear role definition, and systematic accountability, that insight is visible in its most fully realized pre-industrial form at Hampton Court. The Tudor court had worked through the same organizational problems that Escoffier would revisit 3 centuries later, and arrived at structurally similar solutions. They did not have Escoffier's vocabulary. They did not have his published codification. They did not have culinary schools or professional journals. What they had was the practical wisdom of 200 people solving the same logistical challenges every single day for generations in the same building. And the solutions they developed were in their essentials, right? Let me give you a specific example of what I mean, because I think the concrete comparison is more illuminating than the general claim. In a modern Michelin-star restaurant kitchen, there is a role called the expediter, sometimes called the abor from the French word meaning to bark or call out. The expediter is the person who stands at the pass-the-counter between the kitchen and the dining room and coordinates the flow of finished dishes from the kitchen to the tables. They check every plate for accuracy and quality before it goes out. They manage the timing. They are the last quality control checkpoint before the food reaches the guest. Now go back to the Tudor kitchen at Hampton Court. The Clare of the kitchen, standing at the serving place, who allocated dishes to various diners according to their rank, who checked every dish before it moved from the kitchen into the corridors that led to the Great Hall. Same role, same position, same function, for 190 years apart. Or consider the modern brigade's distinction between the saucier, who makes the sauces, and the rotis, who roasts the meat. Different skills, different knowledge, different physical space in the kitchen. In Hampton Court, the master cook of the roasting fires in the great kitchen and the sergeant of the sorcery responsible for mustard garnishes and all varieties of sauces. Same separation, same logic. Or the modern pastry chef who operates in their own section of the kitchen with their own team, whose world is technically and creatively distinct from the main kitchens. At Hampton Court, the pastry house with its 4 ovens overseen by its own sergeant, producing nothing but pies and tarts all day. The parallel is not perfect. The scales are different. The specific techniques are different. The ingredients are different. The social context is entirely different. But the organizational skeleton is recognizable. And that skeleton was first assembled in this particular configuration in the kitchens of Hampton Court sometime around 1530. Here's a question that I find genuinely fascinating. When did cooking become a profession? Not just something that people did for money. A profession. Something with career paths and transferable skills and professional standards and the expectation of mastery. Something that a person could build their identity around and that carried its own form of dignity and social recognition. Most food historians would point to some version of the answer. The late 18th or early 19th century in France, the rise of the restaurant, the formalization of culinary training, the beginning of the celebrity chef. And they are not wrong. Those developments were enormously important. But the claim made by the food historian Peter Bryers, who did more than perhaps any other single person to restore and understand the Hampton Court kitchen complex, that what Henry VIII built was the world's first professional kitchen, is a serious claim that deserves to be taken seriously. What makes a kitchen professional rather than simply large? I would argue it is 3 things. First, specialized roles that require specific training and cannot be immediately substituted for one another. Second, a career structure that rewards demonstrated competence with advancement and reward. Third, institutional accountability, a system of oversight that holds workers responsible for their outputs according to defined standards. Hampton Court had all 3 in 1530. The specialization was structural. The departments existed precisely because the tasks they performed required specific expertise. The career structure was real kitchen boys who became grooms, who became yeomen, who became sergeants, who became master cooks. The accountability was meticulous. The Clare of the green cloth, the Clare of the kitchen, the SA protocols, the documented batch of court entitlements. This was not domestic cooking at scale. This was professional cooking, and it predates the emergence of the French restaurant tradition by roughly 2 centuries. There is something else that the Tudor kitchen gave the world that I think is underappreciated, and it connects to the supply chain conversation we had earlier. The Tudor kitchen was, to my knowledge, one of the first operations in English history to approach food sourcing with anything resembling what we would now call systematic procurement. The contracted fish supplier, Thomas Hewitt of High, the formal agreements with livestock farms, the accountants tracking every item that entered the building, the 3-mile water pipe, the fish ponds, the herb garden, none of this was accidental or improvised. It was designed over time in response to the operational needs of producing food reliably at this scale. And the principles it embodies: reliable suppliers, diversified sourcing, quality control, at intake, separation of categories, and storage, are the principles that every large-scale food operation today still uses. Your hospital cafeteria works on versions of these principles. Your hotel's restaurant does. The airline that feeds you on a long-haul flight does. The specific forms are different. The technology is incomparably more sophisticated. But the underlying logic of managing a complex food supply chain to produce consistent outputs for a large number of people at defined times, that logic was being worked out in a cobbled courtyard at Hampton Court between 1529 and 1547. I want to talk about one more legacy before we bring this part of the story to its close. The Tudor kitchen gave us, in a very real sense, the concept of food as theater. The idea that a meal is not just sustenance, but an experience, a curated, designed multi-sensory event that communicates something to the people who receive it. We explored this in depth when we talked about the spectacular feasts, the sugar castles, the fire-breathing peacocks. But the deeper legacy of that impulse is visible everywhere in modern food culture. The chef's tasting menu that tells a story through its courses, the open kitchen in a modern restaurant designed so that diners can watch the cooking and feel connected to the performance of it. The Instagram-era obsession with how food looks before you eat it. The Michelin Guide, which rewards not just taste, but the total experience of dining. All of these things have roots that extend through a long and winding cultural history back to a sensibility that was fully formed in the Tudor court. The idea that food communicates, that how a meal is presented says something about who is presenting it, that there's a relationship between the effort invested in creating a dish and the respect conveyed to the person who receives it. Henry VIII understood this so intuitively that he built 55 rooms to operationalize it. And the best chefs in the world today are still in their own ways working from the same premise. When Queen Victoria opened Hampton Court Palace to the public in 1838, a century after the kitchens had last been used, she made a decision that has had profound and continuing consequences for our understanding of this history. Because suddenly the building was available for study, for restoration, for interpretation. The food historian Peter Briers, who spent years working to restore and understand the kitchen complex for historic royal palaces, has described what it was like to actually cook in those restored kitchens for the first time in 250 years, to light the fires in the great kitchen and produce food using the original methods and equipment. What he found was something that surprised him. The building taught him things that no document had recorded. The layout of the rooms, the placement of the hatches, the relationship between the boiling house and the great kitchen. All of it made operational sense that only became clear when you were actually using the space. The knowledge was in the architecture. The workers who had spent their lives in those rooms had embedded their professional wisdom in the structure of the building itself. And that, I think, is the most extraordinary legacy of all. Not the famous feasts, not the organizational innovations, not the supply chains, but the fact that the accumulated professional knowledge of generations of workers, people who lived their entire working lives in those rooms and left no written record, is still present, still legible in the stones of Hampton Court today. Their names are lost. Their faces are lost. Their personal histories, their ambitions, their friendships and grievances and moments of quiet pride. Almost all of it is gone, but the building remembers them. The relationships between the rooms remember them. The way the corridors connect, and the courtyards orient, and the serving hatches open, all of it speaks. If you know how to listen to the knowledge and judgment of people who are 500 years gone, there's something almost overwhelming about that if you let yourself feel it. 200 workers, mostly anonymous, most of them not counted in any formal historical record, laboring in conditions that we've spent this entire video try to honestly describe. Working through epidemics and injuries and cold winters, and the constant physical grind of keeping those fires burning, climbing their slow ladders from the bottom to wherever they could get to for a king who would never know their names. And somehow in the aggregate, in the accumulated weight of their daily effort, they created something that outlasted them by 5 centuries. Something that is still standing, still legible, still teaching people things today. I do not know quite what to call that. A monument, maybe. Except monuments are usually intentional. This was not intentional. It was the byproduct of people showing up and doing their jobs day after day to the best of their ability. But its permanence feels like something. We're almost at the very end of this story. Almost. There is one final thing I want to do before we close, one question I have been saving for last, because it is the question that this entire journey has really been about. Not the facts and dates and departments and protocols. All of that has been the scaffolding. The real question is simpler and older than any of it. What does it mean to feed people? What is the human significance of the act of cooking for others, of taking raw ingredients and transforming them through skill and attention and knowledge into something that sustains another person? And what can the people who spent their lives doing that in the most demanding, most professional, most extraordinary food operation of the 16th century tell us about an answer to that question? That is where we are going, and we are almost there. Let me tell you what it looks like today. You walk through a gate, the old tradesman's entrance on the north side of the palace. The same gate the deliveries have been arriving through for 5 centuries. You pass under an arch into a cobbled courtyard, and then the kitchen opens in front of you. The first thing that hits you is the scale. The ceilings are higher than you expect. The fireplaces are larger than any fireplace you have ever stood next to, large enough as the guides remind you for an adult to stand upright inside them. The stone walls are dark, stained with something that took 200 years of fire and smoke to produce. The air smells of wood and time. And on the days when the demonstration fires are lit, something older than that, something that connects directly to the moment you step into that, feels less like a museum and more like a pause. Nearly 1 million people visit Hampton Court Palace every year. A significant number of them come specifically for the kitchens. And when they walk through those rooms, through the boiling house and the pastry house and the great kitchen with its 6 enormous hearths, they are walking through the same spaces where real people live their entire working lives. The same floors, the same stone, the same walls that absorbed over generations. The particular combination of heat and labor and human presence that made this place what it was. The char beams are still there. The soot marks are still there. The little bench in front of the roasting fireplace where the spit worker sat still there. So, we've come a long way together. We started in the dark before sunrise with a fire that needed to be lit. We followed the supply chains across 3 mi of clay pipe and across the oceans to the spice markets of Asia. We climbed the hierarchy from the spit workers' bench to the master cook's domain. And we looked honestly at what each rung of that ladder cost its occupants. We watched a king panic about disease and move every night to a different bed. We met Richard Roos, who made a terrible joke and paid for it with his life. We packed up the entire operation and shipped it to a field in France for 18 days of diplomatic spectacle. We spent time with the women who fed the other England, the ordinary, daily, uncounted England. And we acknowledged how little history wrote down about what they did. We sat with the sweating sickness. We watched the fires go out in 1737. We drew the lines of connection forward to a Frenchman named Escapier, working in the Savoy Hotel in London in 1890, who formalized principles that the Tudor kitchen had been practicing for 3.5 centuries. And now we are here at the end with the question I saved for last. What does it mean to feed people? I have been thinking about this throughout this entire project, and I want to try to answer it honestly, because I think the answer that comes out of the Tudor kitchen story is more interesting than a simple platitude about nourishment or hospitality. The Tudor kitchen was at its most fundamental level an act of civilization. Not in the grand sweeping sense that word sometimes gets used, not civilization as empire or culture or progress. Civilization in the most literal, immediate physical sense. The act of taking a hostile, raw world and organizing it through collective human effort into something livable, into warmth and sustenance and enough. Because that is what cooking is really. It is the organized human response to the fact that we are mortal physical creatures who need to eat. Every kitchen in history, from the most modest peasant's hearth to the 55 rooms of Hampton Court, represents that same fundamental act. People deciding to take the chaos of the natural world and bring it under some form of intentional human control to produce through skill and labor and attention the conditions necessary for others to survive, and with luck to flourish. And what the Tudor kitchen shows us more vividly than almost any other example I know of is how much human dignity and intelligence and organizational genius can be embedded in that act. Here is something I've been sitting with. If you had told one of those 200 workers at Hampton Court that their daily labor would 500 years later be the subject of a story that millions of people might hear, they had not have understood what that meant. The concept of a YouTube channel did not exist, of course, but more fundamentally, the idea that their work was worth telling a story about would probably have felt incomprehensible to them. They were making food. They were doing their jobs. They were surviving. But we know something they did not know. We know that the knowledge embedded in their daily work, the organizational genius, the professional culture, the accumulated culinary expertise would shape every professional kitchen that came after them. We know that the problems they solved in those 55 rooms are the same problems that professional kitchens are still solving today. We know that the building where they work still stands, and that when you walk through it, you can still feel the presence of what they did there. They mattered. Their work mattered, even though they never got to know it. There's a line from the historical record that I keep coming back to. It appears in the documentation of the Hampton Court kitchens from the food historian Peter Briers. The man who spent years working to restore and understand this place. Who actually lit the fires in the great kitchen for the first time in 250 years. Who cooked the dishes. Who stood the spit racks. Who moved through the passages carrying things so that he could understand why the layout was the way it was. He described the kitchen as the world's first professional kitchen. I do not think that is hyperbole. I think it is an accurate description of something extraordinary that happened in a cobbled courtyard 15 miles outside London sometime, around 1529. An ordinary group of workers, most of them poor, most of them anonymous, most of them working under conditions that were genuinely brutal, collectively created something that had never existed before at that scale. A system for feeding people professionally, reliably, beautifully, every day. So what does this mean for us? What do we take from this story into our own lives? I want to offer 3 things because I have been thinking about them, and they feel honest. The first is this. The people who do the work that keeps civilization functioning are rarely the people who get remembered. The workers in the Tudor kitchen are almost completely nameless to us. The people who are named Henry VII and Berlin, Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas Cromwell are remembered because they had power, and power generates documents. The people who actually made the food, who kept the fires burning, who turned the spits and scrubbed the pots and managed the supply chains, they are gone. And yet, without them, Henry VIII goes hungry. Without them, the court does not function. Without them, none of the history that gets recorded and remembered happens at all. That asymmetry between the people who do the essential work and the people who get to be remembered is not unique to the Tudor period. It is one of the oldest and most persistent features of human social organization. Recognizing it does not fix it, but recognizing it seems important. The second thing, the Tudor kitchen workers showed up every morning in conditions that were genuinely difficult, with limited options and no safety net, and a hierarchy that was not always fair. They showed up and they did their best at what they were doing. And the cumulative result of that collective showing up over 200 years was something extraordinary. There is something quietly radical about that. About the idea that ordinary people doing ordinary work collectively and over time can produce results that outlast the kings and the empires and the political. Dramas that history usually decides are the real story. The Tudor kitchen is still there. Henry VIII is dead, and his 6 wives are dead, and his empire is long since dissolved. But the kitchen is still there. The third thing is personal and maybe a little sentimental, but I think it deserves to be said. The act of cooking for someone is one of the most ancient forms of human care. Before language, before agriculture, before civilization in any recognizable form, there was fire and there was food. There was someone using the one to transform the other for the benefit of another person. That is not nothing. That is in some fundamental way the first thing that made us human. This capacity to take something raw and make it into something nourishing and then to share it. The Tudor kitchen took that ancient act and scaled it to a level of complexity and professionalism that the world had never seen before. They took something primal and they organized it, systemized it, hierarchized it, and made it run. But underneath all of that organizational sophistication, underneath the hierarchy and the assay protocols and the clerks of the green cloth and the 19 departments, underneath all of it, the fundamental act was still the same. Someone was cooking for someone else. Somewhere in the great kitchen at Hampton Court on an ordinary morning in 1535, a man whose name we do not know stood at a fireplace large enough to stand inside, turning a spit loaded with meat that he would never be permitted to eat in the service of a king who did not know he existed. And the meat turned slowly, and the fat dripped into the pan below, and the smell of roasting oak and rendering beef filled the room, and the court outside prepared for the day's meals. It was ordinary. It was essential. It was in its way perfect. And across 500 years, with all of the distance and all of the change that those 5 centuries contain, I find it strangely moving that we can still, if we pay attention, step into that room and feel something of the presence of what was done there. The stones, remember. The walls, remember. The fireplace is big enough to stand inside. Remember, and tonight, at least for a little while, so do we. Thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me, with these stories, with these people who so rarely get their stories told. I know this has been a long journey, probably the longest video I have ever made. And the fact that you are still here, still listening, still wanting to know what happened next, That means more to me than I know how to say properly. If this story gave you something, a new way of thinking about the people behind history's famous moments, or a renewed appreciation for what cooking and feeding people actually means, or just a few hours of comfortable company in the quiet of your evening, then it was worth every minute of the research and the writing and the sitting in front of a screen trying to find the right words. There is so much of history that belongs to the famous and the powerful. And there is so much more of it that belongs to everyone else, the ordinary, the unnamed, the people who kept the fires burning while the kings made the decisions. I think those stories deserve to be told, and I will keep telling them. The next story is already taking shape. It is a different world from this one, different century, different culture, different kind of darkness and beauty, but it has the same quality that drew me to the Tudor kitchen. It is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the margins of history and leaving behind a world they never got to see. When that story is ready, I will be here, and I hope you'll be too. Sleep well.